This all went down during the spring break of my junior year of high school. My school was in a pretty small Iowa town, with a district spanning several smaller hamlets. During the summer of 2014, a few friends of mine put together a film club that would make short films and compete in national film festivals against other schools. We were a pretty small group and found it kind of difficult to get together for any actual filming until spring break of 2015, when we made plans for a little excursion. 4 of us ended up going on the trip, myself and 3 members of the club, Jake, Bill, and Kyle. We ended up choosing to go camping out at Mossy Glen Hollow, a supposedly haunted state park up in northeastern Iowa. Since the 1850s, there have been several murders and suicides out at Mossy Glen, including a few decapitations and a hired hitman in the 1930s. Being the edgy teens that we were, we jumped at the chance to go hiking and camping somewhere like that. It was within 15 minutes of a small town, so stocking up on food wouldn't be that big of an issue either. So, all lights green. We load up 2 of our sedans, programmed the GPS, and off we were for a spring break, camping in some haunted woods. After the first hour and a half on the road, a few red flags began to fly. After the last large town before getting way out in the boondocks, my phone's data signal cut out, and the GPS randomly changed directions on us. Since none of us had any idea where the hell we were at, or where Mossy Glen was supposed to be, we didn't have much choice but to blindly follow the new route. Here's a little something about Iowa land distribution, especially up north, because the hills can get so uneven at places. You end up with portions of land that are too steep or too rocky to farm, or small flat basins that are surrounded by steep slopes that it makes farming incredibly difficult. Over the course of several decades, you end up with farms buying a plot of farmland with patches of unworkable land stuck in between. Rather than buy this land and pay property tax on it for several centuries, as these farms stay in the family for generations, the land either remains unpurchased and public, repurchased by the state, or donated to the state or DNR. Many of these plots get designated as state parks or preserves surrounded by private property, such as soon as we found out Mossy Glen Hollow. This explains the private property signs we saw by the lake, which was land purchased right next to the unusable boulder-covered creek. This is a bit important for the sake of the story, and now that you understand it, we will dive back in there. Once we're firmly in the middle of nowhere, our GPS took us off the paved highways and onto gravel roads. At this point, you typically would see the usual brown Iowa DNR signs, designating that you were near a state park, but there were none. There weren't even any tree clumps to indicate that you were near some sort of forest. Red flag number 2. Another 10 minutes or so into the drive, and the gravel road soon turns into a dirt road, then a low maintenance road, then a Class B minimum maintenance road, with Iowa's dedication to road preservation. This basically means that somebody probably came by and took a peek in the 90s and promptly forgot about its existence. As we came around the last hilly bend that the GPS shows on our route, we see a farmhouse with a large machine shed with no lights or activity around either, and no cars in the driveway. A bit weirded out that a house would be right next to a state park, we slow down and keep rolling. To our dismay, however, the road dissolves into a mess of washed tractor tire gouges from last fall's harvest. We stop the cars as far down as we can pass without getting hung up on a frozen rut and unpack some of our equipment. The road gradually narrows, snakes down the middle of a field, and turns down into the small but very thick clump of woods at the bottom of a wide ravine. We get out and hike down the gradually steepening slope and take in the scenery. At first, everything looks like a pretty damn cool set to film at. There are several lime outcrops hanging off the hillside, a footpath with some picturesque tree overhang, and even a few birds out that made an unseasonal return from wintering down south. We can all hear some water running, but can't identify a source from the trail. Looking off in any direction, all that we see was a seemingly endless sea of trees. At the bottom of the hill was a small pond, in the middle of a grassy clearing with a fence. As we approached the fence, we noticed a sign: private property, keep out. Bill checks his watch and realizes it's almost time for dinner, so we trek back to our vehicles and hook up the GPS. The nearest town over was a little place called Edgewood that had several diners and a gas station to load up on supplies for the week. We brought some canned food, but not much beyond that. As we got to town, we realized that Edgewood was a lot smaller than we had expected. Less than 900 people, it would turn out. Everyone knows everyone in these small towns, so we got several weird looks when 4 strangers rolled up with plates from the other side of the state. Kyle thought to ask the cashier and a few people at the gas station about Mossy Glen Hollow, and why the only route in was through some dude's field on a busted out dirt road. To our surprise, nobody had even heard of a place called Mossy Glen, nor could they figure out why the hell 4 high schoolers suddenly rolled into town looking for the place. Red flag number 3. We shrug it off as just a few crazy locals and take off back down the dirt trail. As we round the corner back near the farmhouse, we notice all the lights are off and nobody seems to be home. I suggest that we leave some sort of note on the house door that we're going to be parking on the side of the road near their place, just to be safe. It's starting to get late in the day, and being this far out in the country, it wouldn't be unheard of to come face to face with a shotgun when the homeowner finds our cars, since the road is impassable from that point onwards. Parking there wouldn't realistically block anyone off the road and would still technically be on public land. We hike back down the wooded trail and start scouting for a place to set up camp for the night, making sure to be on the public side of the fenced pond area. We discover that the sea of trees that we saw earlier was actually quite a bit thinner when seen from below. In fact, the dirt path led to a decently sized clearing with a creek and small waterfall cutting through the limestone deposits. None of us could believe that we had missed such a thing a few hours earlier. When Bill comes to a realization, he disappears around the corner, back into the trees, and emerges at the top of the trail a few minutes later. Though we could plainly see him, the trees lined up just right so that he could not see anything beyond the rocks below the path ledge. Continuing further up the creek, we noticed that there are conveniently placed rocks, about the perfect distance apart to step without disturbing the water or surrounding rocks. One could walk almost silently up and down the creek while the sound of the water masked the steps. Not thinking much of it, we take some pictures of the large moss-covered boulders and get some pretty nice scenic shots. We find a place to make camp, and everything is going great until we approach the waterfall. Just before the waterfall sat a clearing without any large boulders or rocks, and an odd arrangement of logs. One sat horizontal, supported at each end by two piles of rocks. In front sat a crude stone circle with a pile of burnt logs inside. A fire pit with a bench. Though a bit of a surprise at first, we shrug it off as some weekend project that the people up at the house put together. After all, with such a cool place just a short walk from home, why not? I have a similar fire pit set up at home, so I'm not overly concerned. Hey, what the hell is this? Kyle yells it from a boulder a few yards ahead. On it sat a blaze orange beanie, a single gardening glove, and an empty can of beer. Oh, and a stick of deodorant that had seen some serious wear. Looking closer at the beer can, we realized that it must have been opened fairly recently. Foam is still fresh in the bottom of the can, and it had a fumey smell. Bewildered by what the hell we just found, Jake starts looking around the other side of the boulders upstream of the items. "Holy shit, there's a cave!" he shouts back to us. Later he told us the cave was large enough to comfortably fit a person inside, and that, more disturbingly, he saw some red fabric inside as well. Before he can get a good look around, Kyle calls the three of us back over with a sense of urgency. He speaks very quietly to us and indicates that we shouldn't shout back. "Shampoo," he whispers, pointing urgently down at his feet. Sure enough, in the mud and leaves, there's a blue bottle of Suave shampoo right next to the creek. At this point, we're all adequately freaked out and ready to call our little soiree quits. Bill remains pretty sure that this is just junk left behind by the people at the house after a weekend and a few too many Bush lights. But things don't just add up to me. There's one detail that I've been leaving out at this point. The day before, this part of Iowa got some heavy rain, which contributed to the mud situation on the dirt road and on the trail. With the combination of wind and rain, the items on the rocks would have shown some signs of being wet, if not, then displaced entirely. Also, the air was pretty cold, as it is every year around this time, not getting above the mid-40s for the whole week. Then everything starts to click for me. Whoever drank the beer and left the shampoo, hat, glove, deodorant must have done this sometime this morning. The fire pit also had fresh char marks on the rocks, and the wood had not been wet for a while, meaning it must have been lit last night at the earliest. The small cave would have provided enough shelter from the rain to stay dry, without the freezing temperatures all through the day. Whoever was using shampoo out here must have had little other choice to do so. If it was the homeowners, they would have had to be seriously masochistic to bathe in the shallow, freezing, rocky creek rather than at home. If it wasn't, then we likely weren't alone right now. Whoever left these things out left in a hurry, and if they were here 4 hours ago, they would have been able to see us on the trail cliff long before we even knew they were down here. Remembering the arrangements of rocks on the stream, they could have even been leaving their camp just as we were coming down the dirt trail. As I processed this, I started to look around at my surroundings and realized that the small area was bordered by the thick trees on the trail side, several sets of huge boulders on the pond side, and limestone cliffs everywhere else. Due to the tree, rock, and hill cover, you could light a fire in the pit at night, and no one around you would even know. The illusion of being able to see up the dirt trail from the camp, but not down, played in reverse from the cliffs. If you were wearing brown or green, you could easily see down from the rocks on top of the camp below, while blending in with the trees above. Coming to these realizations, I noticed something else. Something more sinister. The birds and small animals that were previously heard are now quiet, aside from the soft babble of the creek. The entire place is completely silent. As I start to explain this to the rest of the group, I see the wheels turning in their heads as well. Jake starts to head back to the small cave, when a rustling up on the limestone ridge catches our attention. Something large was shifting around up there, something that apparently didn't want Jake to see what was in the cave. We all look up at whatever or whoever made the noise as it started shuffling down the ridge towards the makeshift camp. Because of the high cliff, the only way down to us would be going all the way back down to the pond and then double back up the stream. Realizing this and almost crapping ourselves at how open we were, we book it back down the stream, up the dirt path across the field, and back to our cars. On the drive back to Edgewood, we all try and process what the hell just happened. I take a look at a satellite map, and the only really accessible way to the cliff where we heard the noise would be to walk up there from the pond. It was too craggy to approach from the adjacent field to the east. Whatever made that noise would have been large, and a deer getting up there wouldn't necessarily be out of the question, but I doubt it. It would have had to have been some incredible timing to have started moving around just as Jake began looking at the cave, and whatever red fabric was inside. Kyle found a report of an escaped convict from a local prison a few weeks ago, and was convinced that it was his camp that we found, though we were all doubtful at best of this idea. To satisfy his concerns, we'd agreed to report the strange thing we found to the police, anonymously, since we all really wanted to get home at this point. None of us followed up with them, and I doubt anything came of it. The small, close-knit town police department gets a report of strange sightings for some stranger the same day that 4 high schoolers roll up and park outside a farmer's house for a few hours and then book it out. Doesn't exactly spell high-threat criminal activity to me. Still, things still just don't seem to add up. Whoever came running down that cliff, if indeed it was a who, wanted to keep whatever was inside that cave hidden, but not enough to actually fight 4 decently tall and able teenagers. We figured he just wanted to scare us off, since the noises seemed to stop once we reached the dirt path. I thought it odd that someone living out in the woods with something seemingly to hide would set up shop in a state park. That is, until I checked my GPS again. That little reroute that it took us on was an old entrance to the park that had been cut off by the purchase of the lake area, sometime between the map records used for Google's navigation being updated and that day. The current entrance to the park is about 2 miles north of where the GPS sent us, thinking it was a faster route. The place we were at was still public land for sure, but not quite what we pictured. So dude in Mossy Glen Hollow, let's not meet again. I am a 32-year-old man, yet, as I say this in broad daylight, it still haunts me, to the point that merely thinking about it, or in this case, sharing the memory, is enough to send chills down my body and make me feel like a terrified child. I have only shared this experience with a handful of people over the past 10 years, because of how terrifying of an experience it was, but I feel like it can be therapeutic to get it off my chest and share it with others. Perhaps others have had similar experiences. To tell this story and to give it justice, I have to tell you of an experience that happened 3 years before the terrifying encounter Buckle up. This will be long. My name is Joshua, and I live in Arkansas. And in late 2003, near the middle of fall, right before it started getting really cold, my wife and I were invited to camp with a friend of mine and his girlfriend at Sugarloaf Lake in Oklahoma. I say camp, but the actual plan was to meet at Sugarloaf, and my friend, Bob, wanted to take me and my wife around to some paranormal places in the Sugarloaf area. So we got there around 7 p.m. I was driving a white Ford 1996 F-150. Bob was driving a 1980-something white Celebrity, which was a really piece of rubbish vehicle. Anywho, it was late, dusk becoming dark, and we all climbed into Bob's car, and he took us around the area, first to an old abandoned house. But other than some raccoons just rustling around, it was a waste of 2 hours. Then he took us to a graveyard that was supposedly haunted. Again, it was a bust. Then an old church that was run down. Yawn. Nothing. At this point, it was getting close to midnight, and my wife and I were pretty bored. And I spoke up to Bob, saying, "Man, this really hasn't been that freaky of a night." That's when Bob smiled, saying that he was saving the best for last. He handed me a few Polaroid pictures of a hillside covered in trees and daylight. I asked him what it was, and he asked me if I saw a house or any type of light pole or anything in the picture, to which I replied, no. He took the picture back and said that's because there isn't, and there's no power lines either. About this time, he turned down an old dirt road and passed a small house. Then after that, it was 2 miles of dirt road with woods on either side of a barbed wire fence, on the other with about 2 acres of field connecting to a wooded hillside. Nothing to light the night except the full moon above, and the clear starry sky. After what seemed like forever, he stopped the car and told us to all get out. We did as he said. He walked us to the side of the car, where the fence, field, and wooded hillside was. He looked at his cell phone, which, his phone and my phone, had no signal. This was 03, and this area had no cell towers, but he looked at his phone and it read 11:57. He told us all to watch the middle of the hillside. Even in the complete darkness, I could tell that it was the same field and hillside from the picture. 2 minutes go by and nothing had changed. Then at exactly midnight, a small flickering light goes off in the middle of the hillside. A chill runs down my back as my wife, Bob, and his girlfriend and myself watch this small light, which to me looked like an old kerosene lantern, begin to move, swaying back and forth. We watched in complete silence for what seemed like several minutes, when I finally spoke up and asked what the story was with this. Bob replied he didn't know, but locals had told him that at midnight every night, this lantern would light up and sway back and forth through the woods until the sun comes up and then it disappears. Nobody knew what the story was. At the time, I was a 19-year-old guy who didn't think anything would scare or hurt me. So, since there were no homes around, I yelled out, "We see you now. Not so scary with your little lantern." Bob hushed me, but it was too late. My wife screamed and pointed. I was laughing, but my laughter stopped as I looked up to the hillside to see the lantern swaying back and forth, but moving down the hillside towards the field at an inhuman pace. gliding. It began to speed across the field towards the car. We didn't stick around to see what it was, because within a second, we were in the car flying down the dirt road back to the lake. We looked back and saw the lantern slowly moving back up the hillside to where it first appeared. The ride back was silent, until Bob spoke up, saying, "Crap, I forgot to put gas in earlier, and the only store around is closed. And if we decided to go back out anywhere, it would be best to take my truck until he could get gas in it in the morning, as he only had about half a quarter tank left." I said okay, and a few minutes later we arrived back at Sugarloaf Lake. We had parked by the lake docks, and we dropped my tailgate and sat and spoke about what had just happened. Bob's girlfriend was pregnant at the time, and told him she was hungry. He told her we had brought some snacks, but he said she needed actual food. But since the local store was closed, he asked if he could take my truck to the next town over to get some food, because his car wouldn't have enough gas to get us into town. I obliged. We shut our cooler, put the tailgate up, and loaded into my truck. I turned the key and nothing happened. My truck was dead. Deader than dead. No ding, no lights, no clicking noise. Nothing. For all intents and purposes, you would think that the alternator was out. This was strange, and after the night we had been through, it made us feel very uneasy. We got out of the truck and popped the hood. We pulled Bob's car around to the front and attempted to jumpstart my truck with his car. This is where it gets even weirder. As soon as we connected the jump cables to his battery and mine, his girlfriend starts his car, and within a second of the cables in between, the connectors start to smoke, and in a flash of fire, they burn up, and within a few seconds, they were nothing more than bits of melted rubber and ash, with only the end clamps still on our batteries. Bob runs and turns off his car engine, and we take the clamps off our batteries. We look at each other in the early moon and starlit night. Did I mention there were no light poles around? And we both get a bad feeling at the exact same time, as we suddenly realize we had been hearing a distant noise in the lake that was getting louder. It was like a motorboat. Now, like I said, this was the time of year it was starting to get cold, especially at night. We were bundled up as it was, and we were standing still on land at night. But somebody was out on a boat after midnight? When it had to be chilly, as there's all that wind hitting them. And from the sound of this motor it was going pretty fast, but we saw nothing. That is until the boat was about 50 yards away, and a very bright spotlight comes on, temporarily blinding us all. Bob and I tell the women to get into his car and lock the doors. I reach into the bed of my truck and give Bob a tire tool, and I pick up another, as I work at a tire shop and had all kinds of tools of the trade in my truck. We were standing in front of the vehicles in the middle, the hoods up on both, as the boats pull up to the dock, and two heavily bearded men in their 30s to 40s step out of the boat and walk up. It's hard to give an accurate description, as their spotlight was still pointed to us, and it covered the men in an eerie shadow whilst blinding Bob and I. They look at us, at our vehicles, and one glances in the direction of the car, at the women, and then back at us, and lets out a small chuckle. "You fellas got into some sort of car trouble?" one asks as he lights up a cigarette. "Yeah, but it's nothing we can't handle," I stammer. The guy with the cigarette sniffs the air and looks down between Bob and I's feet, and sees the still smoking ashes of what used to be the jump cable. Looks like it was more than your terrible jump cables could handle. Y'all need some help? We got some tools on the boat. That I think could help fix you guys' problem right up. Then the other man, who had chuckled in the beginning, says, fix them right up. I'm speechless at this moment, and my mouth is probably hanging agape. I can't remember as the two men walked back to their boat, and we heard what sounds like chains rattling around as we try to make out what they're doing, but the spotlight was so blinding we could barely see. Anyway, the chain noise was enough, and Bob looked at me without saying a word, and we both jumped into his car and drove the hell out of there. For the next few hours we drove to a populated area of the houses, which wasn't mainly in the rural area we were pretty much stuck in, since we had very little fuel. But we all sat in the car mostly quiet, looking around in all directions in near panic, thinking that at any given moment those men would find us. It had been a very scary ordeal. Bob would turn his headlights on every now and then, thinking he had seen some movement in the dark. After a while the women fell asleep, and Bob and I spoke about how strange this all was, and he laughed, saying, I told you it would be a scary night. I just didn't know if it would be this sort of scary. At this point, the paranormal lantern wasn't even the main thing freaking me out, but the men never showed, and eventually the morning was on its way, and it was about 20 minutes until sunrise, and Bob asked if I wanted to go see if the lantern really disappears at sunrise. I asked if he was sure he had enough gas to get there, and he said yeah. The local store opens up in about an hour, so that'll be fine. I tell him in that case, then yes. We wake the women up and drive back to the hillside. We get there with about 4 minutes left of sunrise, and we still see the lantern swaying in the woods. Bob looks at me and I smile, and do the motion for zipping my lips, as we all watch in wonder, as right as the sunrise hits the hills, does the lantern slowly fade away into nothing. After this, we get back in the car and drive back to the lake, feeling safer now. When we get there, there is no sign of the boat, and the hood of my truck is still up, and the doors are still locked. On a whim, I tell Bob I'm going to try and start the truck one more time before he drives us somewhere, where I can get a cell signal and call for help. And I'll be damned, the truck started right up there and then without hesitation. We all went our separate ways, happy to have seen the sunrise and counting our blessings, and swearing to leave the paranormal investigating in the area to others, and swearing that we never wanted to come back to this area and run into the boat people again. However, all things fade with time, even fear and common sense. 3 years later, Bob, who I haven't seen in almost 2 years at that point, calls me up and says he has a proposition for me. He goes on to tell me he has a group of himself and 3 other Wiccans who go out and do seances in haunted places, and asked me if I'd be willing to film one of their sessions in a haunted place for their records, and that they would even pay for my services. I am no Wiccan, but I've always loved the paranormal. Even after what I went through at Sugarloaf, I still had an itch to scratch when it came to getting scared and dealing with the paranormal and the unknown, and I told him yes, I would love to go with them, but I had no interest in joining in, but was okay with watching and just getting to be out there and looking into the paranormal once again. So of course my next question was, when and where we were going to be doing this. When he answered, I got a terrible gut feeling, and I wish so much that I had trusted my gut and told him that I had changed my mind. Remember that lantern light out near Sugarloaf? As if there were any way I could forget. Yeah? Why? I told my group this story, and they want to do the ritual there and see if we can contact the spirit and find out what it is and why it's there, Bob replied. I don't know, man. Oh, come on, Josh. Trust me, you'll be safe. I'm going to pay you $250 in cash just to sit there and film it. At this time, I was about to become a father, and money was tight due to diapers, formula, and everything involved in being a parent does cost a small fortune. Not to mention it was my first kid and my new wife's first kid, so she had been going crazy spending money on not just the necessities, but also buying only top-of-the-line baby products, like toys, cribs, playpen, baby monitors, strollers, car seat, combination packs, and play/changing tables, diaper genie, designer baby clothes. So, because my wife was putting us in the poorhouse, I had to weigh out my fear of the area as less important, because it's what I needed to make the extra money. So, against my better judgment, I accepted the offer, and a week later, I was in the same seat beat-down celebrity Bob was driving 3 years earlier. This time with Bob and 2 other guys and 1 girl that were complete strangers to me. They each were dressed very gothic and had these pentagram necklaces. It was 11:50 when we got there, and the 4 of them sat in a tight circle, and I was behind them to the right, about 5 feet from the barbed fence that was in front of the field that led to the hillside, and my back was to the hillside and bushes of the fence line, and I was filming my friends circle as they all started chanting something. As I have been sharing this entire post, I have been getting knots in my stomach, knowing that I was coming to this part of the story. This part of the story still haunts my dreams, and even waking hours to this day. I'm going to do my best to describe how the following unfolded. I know that mere words cannot do justice to the pure terror that ensued, or how horribly horrific the events surrounding were. So, when listening to this, turn your imagination all the way up, and believe me when I say this is a turning point in my life, and I was interested in the paranormal. It was a fun hobby to go out ghost hunting or get myself spooked or whatever, but after this night, I will never look at the paranormal as fun or interesting anymore, or whatever. But after this night, I never looked at the paranormal as fun or interesting anymore. I just show respect and stay as far away from it as possible, as there is so much dread just trying to share this. As his group are chanting, Bob lights up this huge candle in the middle of them and opens up some sort of book. It's not like a scary antique spell book or anything like that. He starts reciting words from it, and then he looks at his phone and tells the group to be quiet and to look at him. I turn the camera, and at midnight on the dot, the lantern appears. One member of Bob's group blurts out, "Cool." I roll my eyes. Since the way these people were dressed and the way they carried themselves, the word didn't seem to fit into their vocabulary. Then Bob says to his group to join hands as they attempt to communicate with the spirit. I turn my back to the light and begin to film the group as they began again chanting, and Bob reads from the book. They then start asking questions in hopes the spirit will respond. About this time, a wind picks up, and Bob's candles go out. He tells everyone to hold on and tells me to cut the camera for a minute, and I oblige and stop recording as I watch Bob as he tries with his lighter. Then 2 lighters from his group, but none of them are working. I'm sitting down watching the group when I start hearing rustling behind me. I jump up, leaving the camera on the ground and spin around. Bob and his group are preoccupied with their candle and lighter problem, and as I spin around, I'm blinded by the brightest light I've ever seen. What I believe was the lantern close up and personal, but as quick as it had appeared, the light was gone, and the lantern was nowhere to be seen. If it had been the lantern that blinded me, it had moved from the hillside across the field and right behind me without me realizing it in the span of 30 seconds. I looked around for the lantern on the hillside and nothing. It was midnight, and the lights have always stayed on the hillside. At this moment, the wind quits blowing, and I hear Bob's lighter finally flick and see it light up, and I mutter, guys, did you see that?" They all turn and ask what I'm talking about, but before I can answer them, we all stopped dead in our tracks by a distant laughter coming from somewhere, everywhere, and nowhere. It was all around us nearly. And this is no ordinary laughter. This laughter sounds like the laughter of hundreds, even thousands of children to haunt me at this very moment. As I'm recounting this, I recall looking around the room I'm in. Whenever I think or talk about this experience, I can vividly remember that terrifying sound and hear it in my head. Also, it just occurred to me that when you put the letter S at the beginning of the letter, it spells slaughter. Why did I think of that? The best way I can describe this laughter is for you to imagine a large group of kids singing "Row, row, row your boat." You know how one kid will start and seconds later another will join? And then hundreds of thousands of children laughing. As if one would start laughing and seconds later another would, and the pattern went on in an endless loop. I'm not saying the laughter sounded like the song "Row, row, row your boat." I'm saying they sounded in unison, like when the kids sing "Row, row, row your boat" together. One would start, then another later would start, and then another later, and the laughter was getting louder and closer. There was sinister laughing, goofy laughing, giggling, and all kinds of laughter coming from all around us. This couldn't be real. This sort of thing does not happen. What the hell was happening? I scream at Bob and his group that we need to get the hell out of there, but they were already running for the car, leaving their Wiccan book and candles behind. And without hesitation, I run after them and jump into the car just as the laughter is becoming deafening. We haul us out of there and drive about a mile up the road and pull over, as Bob is in no condition to drive and we're all freaking out. We all get out of the car, pacing around it, asking each other if we had just really heard what we did. I tell Bob, and that I'm so sorry because I had left the camera behind. He says he doesn't care and that he isn't going back for it. At this point, I've got my hands on my knees, panting to try and catch my breath, as I have never in my life before been so terrified. That is when all of our chatter stops, as we once again heard the laughter off in the distance, very quietly at first, but slowly getting closer and closer and louder, until once again it's becoming deafening, and we jump back in the car and speed away. We drive about 6 miles, and for the first 3 we can still hear the laughter in the distance, with our windows down a little. We all begin to calm down by mile 4, when the laughter can no longer be heard, but we have no intention of pulling over, and Bob's friend is in the passenger seat with his phone, waiting for a signal to pop up. As he's about on mile 6, Bob's friend says he got 4 bars, and he hands the phone to Bob as he calls a friend of his who is into the occult and well versed an educator in it. And as we are driving, he describes what happened to the lady. Bob told me his friend told him that she believed in the children of the Hector or something like that. I have no idea about what the Hector is, but something like more of a guess to me. Anyway, as Bob is on the phone speeding out of the area, Me and the other two people in the back seat all get a chill at the same time, and they told me later that it was just like me on the hair of the back of my neck standing on end, and a loud snapping noise coming from the front end of the car, and Bobby's celebrity stops dead in its tracks and will no longer move forward. He tries everything, but the car is not moving. We later discovered that the tie rod had snapped. Anyway, the friend Bob was talking about on the phone only lived about 20 minutes away from where we were, and said that they were on their way. As we sat in the car, nobody spoke after about 3 minutes, until we saw a pair of headlights coming down the road towards us. We knew it was too soon to be Bob's friend, but me and Bob thought maybe we could get a ride from a local, and we all unloaded out the car and stood in front of it, waiting for the vehicle to come fully to a stop. Now, I cannot be certain, but my gut tells me that I am correct. But the vehicle doesn't stop, but as it comes into view, it's a beat-up old pickup truck, and it slows down as in the truck there are two men in their 30s to 40s, with huge beards, and they stare down at us and speed up after passing by. I look at Bob before we can speak, and he was already thinking, the guys from the boat. Before I can say anything back, and see headlights coming from the direction the truck just went. Bob called his friend back and told her to drive like hell and get there now, and hung up. 4 to 5 minutes go by and we see headlights coming. Relieved, we get all our stuff ready thinking it was Bob's friend. Then his phone rings. It was the lady who was coming to get us, telling Bob she took a wrong turn and would be at least another 10 to 15 minutes before she arrives. Bob hangs up the phone and watches in terror, as do I, because the same truck slowly passes again, this time with only one of the boatmen in the truck. This time though, the driver starts to crawl by and says, "Looks like you fellas could use some help," and then speeds up and drives off. This cemented the fact that Bob and I were definitely dealing with the boat guys. But where the hell was the other one? Why wasn't he in the passenger seat? And to make matters worse at this point, something we had almost completely forgotten about due to the boatmen was immediately reminded to us when we began to hear the laughter again in the distance, all around us like before. Over the next few minutes, it started to get closer and closer. I'm almost urinating in my pants at the sound as it's getting deafening and we have nowhere to run this time. And then from behind our car off in the distance, we see 2 sets of headlights coming on and 2 vehicles coming towards us slowly side by side, taking up the entire width of the backcountry dirt road coming our way. The laughter now seems to be coming from the woods on both sides of the road, and we're stuck. And now the laughter is zeroing in on us as if hundreds and thousands of children are within reaching distance of us. There's no wind, no sounds other than the crunch of the tires on the rocky dirt road and the 2 vehicles that are slowly approaching us. With our last shred of hope fading away into the laughter of the children and the headlights of the 2 vehicles surely being driven by the boatmen, we are given a reprieve, as at the time, coming from the other direction, we see another set of headlights coming fast as we hold our breath. The laughter, the boatmen, what could be next? How will we get out of this? And that is when the vehicle that was coming fast pulls up, and it's Bob's friend. She unlocks the car and rolls down her window and begins to tell us to get in. When this happens, the 2 sets of headlights coming from the other direction turn off, and Bob's friend says, "Oh my God, you weren't kidding about the laughing kid," she screams. We begin to tell her about the boat guys, and she turns the car around, and no sooner had she started to drive away did the 2 sets of headlights come on again, this time with their brights on, and they go about a car's length behind the car we're all crammed in. We yell to go, channeling my inner Jeff Goldblum, telling her much faster as she floors it for about a mile or 2. But the vehicles stay on our tracks. For about the next 2 miles after that, we can all hear the laughter way off in the distance with our windows down. But after about 3 minutes, Did it subside? To this day, I have no explanation for what happened, what the laughing children were, why they followed us, and if the boatmen were connected to this somehow, or if they were merely a coincidence of that day that were also there to terrify us. And why they did not react to the laughing children sound. Is the lantern connected to the laughing children, or did Bob and his group mistakenly call forth the laughing children through their ritual? Like I said, this happened years ago, but I still feel just as terrified now when I tell people about it or think about it. I have had constant chills and goosebumps as I've tried to share this. So, I'm a bit shaky. To all of you who think the paranormal is just a fun hobby to get your thrills with, I beg of you and warn you that we are not prepared for what is really out there. You think nothing will scare you or harm you, but you are dealing with unknown things. You have no idea how mundane or powerful the paranormal could be. If you use the paranormal as a thrill-seeking hobby, just use caution and always have your vehicle checked out beforehand. Oh, and watch out for seemingly psychopathic hillbillies and laughing children. I hope we never meet again. This happened during the summer of 2008. For context, I'm a gay male, and at the time, I was in a relationship. Mark was my boyfriend. He was 35 and I was 30. It was July 4th weekend, and my boyfriend wanted to go camping, as he always has every July 4th, usually going with his ex-wife and son who's 7. However, since he is now out the closet, he wanted to take me with him. A little bit about me. I am definitely not an outdoors kind of person. I don't like dirt, I don't like bugs or wild animals, and the thought of not having running water or a roof over my head terrifies me. Yeah, I know I'm spoiled rotten. And as reluctant as I was, Mark persuaded me to go, and reassured me this would be a weekend to remember. Well, he didn't know how right he was yet. He told me we would be leaving Friday morning, which was the 4th, and would come back Monday morning. As we both lived in San Jose, California, the nearest place to camp would be the Santa Cruz Mountains near Felton and the Big Basin Boulder Creek vicinity. We were going to go off-map in a more secluded area to experience nature and less people. We headed out Friday morning at 7 a.m. It was about a 45-minute to an hour drive on the car ride there, and Mark told me that there were people that supposedly lived in the mountains. The first thought that popped into my head was wrong turn and the hills have eyes. I told him that, and he chuckled and said there are some similarities. He explained in great detail that these people were uncivilized, not socialized, and unlike the rest of us in society, and could possibly be dangerous if we encountered them. He went on to tell me they basically live like cavemen and are inbred. He even told me, though he's never come across one, he knows they exist, and he has been told by his brother. Having heard this, I flipped and told him it's a good thing that you just sprung this on me now, because you and I both know I wouldn't have come along knowing this information. He explained that he was just letting me know, not to frighten me, but to inform me of anything should something happen. But, as he guaranteed it, nothing was apparently going to happen. Anyway, we obviously didn't have any way of knowing that. I came prepared, he said, and he said that if he didn't believe me, to open the glove compartment. So I did, and I noticed a leather case. Fearing what I already suspected it was, I opened it before my eyes, and of course was met with a firearm. I don't even know what kind, all I knew is what it was. "This is your guarantee, I suppose," I said to him. "Yes, you must have known on some level that I wouldn't have taken us out to the middle of nowhere and not have protection," he replied. In the back of my mind, he was right, but it didn't stop me from feeling uncomfortable. We reached our destination, Not too long after that, all around me was just nature. Trees, branches, rocks, and boulders. You could barely see the sky from all the trees blocking the sunlight. We began to unload everything from his Toyota Sequoia, and I was impressed by what he'd brought. A 2-bedroom tent, a king-size airbed, and a portable generator with 3 outlets to run power off. Wow, I think maybe this won't be so bad. He smirked that smirk that I loved. Now that I think about it, it was more of an arrogant smirk. Well, my cell didn't get any service whatsoever, and was basically useless, but I did use it as an MP3 player. Smartphones were just starting to make their way available to us, and I had a Motorola Razr, and I was more than ready for an upgrade. Mark said that we needed the power as I had to get some work done this weekend, and he pulled out his laptop from the back seat. "What am I supposed to do, go play outside while you're working?" I said. "Don't be like that. I've seen all the books, magazines, and your Nintendo DS. You obviously have plenty to occupy yourself with," he replied. He was right. Anyway. Friday night, Saturday, and Sunday were uneventful. We took hikes, made campfires, took naps, relaxed, barbecued, and I did actually enjoy myself. That is until Sunday night. We were in bed. Marcos was asleep, and I was reading R.L. Stine, Fear Street books. I absolutely loved those books. That's when I heard something in the distance. Now, I was kind of used to the little noises of animals like chipmunks and squirrels running around through the leaves, but this sounded more distinct. Footsteps, not that of a 4-legged animal. It sounded more like a human, someone who was trying to walk as quietly as possible. I thought it must just be my imagination from reading this book. I set the book down and started to strain to hear more. Closer. Whatever it was getting closer. A bear, perhaps? I look over at Marcos, who was still asleep. Contemplating on what to do, the footsteps reached the tent. Right above our heads was a zipper screen window that we had zipped closed, and was where whatever it was outside had stopped. I held my breath. All I could hear was my rapidly beating heartbeat. I heard someone else breathing. Not Mark. Whoever was outside. I wanted to wake him, but I knew that if I did, he'd make a noise and alert whoever was out there that we were awake. That was when I heard a click. I know that sound. It's the same sound as when I opened my pocket knife. Oh my God, I thought. This is where I'm going to perish. Damn you, Mark. I knew this was a bad idea. That's when I heard a scraping sound running across the tent. I knew what they were going to do, running the knife all around the tent, taunting us. I knew this person had to know one of us was awake, or else why would they be doing that? The sound of the blade went all along the side of the tent and came back around to where we were. Then started again. It was then that I nudged Mark to wake up, and I whispered, "Mark." He started to groan. "Shh," I said. "There's someone outside." I couldn't see his face or anything for that matter because I had turned off the reading light. "There's someone outside. Look." I then saw a flashlight shining on the tent. Mark reached over the side of the bed, grabbed his case, and pulled out that revolver. He yelled, "Stop! Whoever is out there, I'm armed and will not hesitate to shoot you. Leave now, or I will." The flashlight switched off, and whoever it was started to walk away. Not even at a speed walk, just casually walking away without any light. Bear in mind it's pitch black out there. Mark held on to that weapon as I lay there in horror. We didn't say a word. We were just listening for sounds. Somehow, after all that chaos, I must have fallen asleep, because I woke up to Mark shouting my name to come outside. I rubbed my eyes and looked at my watch. It was 6:15 a.m., and it was already light out. I darted up and ran outside to see what he was yelling about. I ran to him to see him kneeling down by his tires, slashed. I looked at the other ones. They too were slashed. The driver's side and passenger window had been shattered. "What the hell?" I shouted. "What are we going to do?" Mark grabbed my hand and said we're going to walk back to the main highway as fast as we can before whoever did this returned. My wallet. I need my wallet and my keys and my phone. My phone was still in the tent inside my bag. I rushed over to the tent, grabbed my messenger bag, realizing my wallet and keys were in the glove box. Oh crap, the glove box. I ran over to the Toyota, swung open the door to notice the glove box was torn open and everything gone. I started to cry. Realizing this situation was too much for me to deal with, my heart sank into my stomach and my knees got weak. I felt like I was going to faint. "Mark, they have my driver's license, my house keys, my money and my bank cards." "Crap," Mark yelled. "Well, we better go. It's only about 1.5 miles to the highway. We're gonna have to flag someone down or find a call box since my phone is dead." Weak and scared, I started walking with him down the dirt road we drove by just a few days prior. As we walked, I could sense there was someone or something else near us. I had that feeling of being watched. "Oh no," I thought. "Please just let us get out of here in one piece." Mark stopped me in my tracks, put his finger up to my lips, and said, "Stop. I don't think we're alone. I can hear leaves crunching. Just keep moving. And know what I told you on the way here. I mean it. I'll do whatever I have to protect us." Speed walking got me tired and thirsty. Then I could hear cars in the distance. We were almost there. It was just a little further. Finally reaching the highway, I pulled out my phone, and I had signal. Not much battery, but just enough to call the police, and Mark called the police. They were there in 5 minutes. 2 patrol cars arrived and Mark explained everything while I sat on the curb. I was questioned about the events and said all my identification and cards were stolen and my house and car keys. The officer told me to cancel all those cards immediately and have my house locks changed ASAP. He suggested I also have the vehicle locks changed as well. 2 or more officers arrived, taking Mark and I back to the camp. I didn't really want to go, but having the police with us, I felt like I was somewhat safe. Mark had called his insurance, and I was expecting a tow truck there soon. When we arrived, 3 of the officers looked around, took pictures, questioned us some more, and sealed off the area with yellow tape, which made it look like a crime scene, which I guess it was, as a crime did take place. The officers asked Mark if we had any idea who this could be. I said no, and furthermore I didn't tell anyone beside my mother and best friend that I was coming, but didn't say where. Mark said he only told his ex-wife, who was at home with their son. I thought maybe her, because she obviously didn't like me, and the feeling was mutual. I brushed that thought off out of my mind though, because it was almost impossible for her to pull it off. Also, Mark and I got together way after they were divorced. It wasn't like I broke them up and turned him out. All her rage at him was then directed at me, but she doesn't scare me. In any case, an officer explained to us it was most likely an isolated incident, and that it could have been someone who most likely didn't agree with our lifestyle. Big surprise. I thought that this was a bit extreme, but didn't really buy into that load of crap the officer was telling us. It seems like he was a bit more clued on that he wanted to let us know. "So what's going to happen now?" I said, and the officer said that they'll have to take the information and report the investigation. And if anything comes up, they'll let us know, and that we may need to testify against culprits. Basically, the officer wasn't much help. He couldn't give us much information as to who did this or why it happened. 10 minutes later, the tow truck arrived and we gathered around all our belongings. I was confused that nothing in the tent was stolen, not even Mark's laptop. Now, if I let my imagination run wild, I could think of other things that didn't make sense, but I don't want to go down that path. On the way back to the city, I was in so much disbelief. I wanted to tell Mark, "See, I told you so." But he looked just as hurt and confused as I did, and I couldn't put it past me to do that. I got home, cancelled everything, had my mum call the locksmith and changed all the house locks. I made an appointment for my car to get all those locks changed, and it was tense knowing that someone knew where I lived and could potentially steal my car. Even though they couldn't unlock my house door, that wouldn't stop them from trying to break in. In the end, nothing ever came of the situation, or if it did, Mark never informed me. We spoke about it, and he was constantly checking in with the police department. He bought a new SUV. He didn't want anything to remember that weekend. We broke up a few months after for other reasons. I've always wondered if he ever went camping again after that weekend. As for me, it's been 12 years since. I now live in a different state where people do camp a lot, and that's great for them. But I haven't camped since, and probably never will. In the year 2000, when I was 10 years old, my parents sent me to a 5-day summer camp in Huntsville, Ontario. This camp was definitely a Bible camp, and being raised without religion, I felt uncomfortable there. But I got along well with my peers. Me and 7 other girls were staying in the room on the far right, and there were 3 other rooms on the main floor, and upstairs is where the camp counselors bunked. The main floor had a very high ceiling, and near the top was a small square door which attached to where the camp counselors were staying. I was staying along the right wall on the bottom bunk. On the 3rd night, me and my bunkmate were having a blast, just talking and telling jokes. But our camp counselor opened the little door at the top of the room and told us to be quiet, so we all went to bed. Out of nowhere I hear Brianna yelling, "Cat, wake up now!" And being the light sleeper I was, I immediately woke up. I didn't know how long I had slept for. I then heard Angel say, "Cat, look over to the bunk in front of you." I was facing the wall, so I turn around and am met with a black figure with long curly hair sitting on the ladder leading up to the top bunk on the bed in front of mine. The moonlight illuminated the entire room, and this figure was completely opaque, shaking her long curly hair. I looked around the room and noticed all of the girls were all accounted for and definitely awake. I stared at this thing for what seemed like an eternity. Every one of the girls were in complete hysterics and crying, but I was dead silent. I couldn't make a peep. I was completely terrified to the point I couldn't blink or even move. I mean, what could I have done? This thing was sitting there right before my eyes. Then this figure stands up and jumps off the ladder and just stood at the edge of the bed for a moment. All of the girls scream, "Cat, get out of there now!" To which the figure moved around in an almost robotic way and started walking towards me. I finally then find the nerve to book it out of the bottom bunk and run to the other side of the room. I run up to Brianna and Angel's bunk and climbed the ladder as quickly as I could. At this point I started becoming hysterical and crying like the rest of them. The figure was still standing near my bed. Angel and I started hugging, and I was too afraid to even open my eyes after what I'd seen. Angel decides to jump down off the bunk, switch the light on, and just like that, the figure was gone. I guess we made a lot of noise, and the camp counselor opened the little door and told us to keep it down. We told her what we'd seen, and she came downstairs to investigate. She came into the room and told us, "There's nothing here. Your mind was probably playing tricks on you. Now back to bed." All of the girls, including myself, were still pretty upset and scared, and just sat up in our bunks talking about what we'd seen. 5 minutes after, we hear screaming coming from the room directly across the hall from us. We all started crying again, and the camp counselors opened the little door and told us, "See what you've started? You have everyone in the cabin scared." The camp counselor went to investigate, and we turned on the lights in our room and opened the door. We hear one of the girls in the room across from us say while crying, "Something lifted our bunk. Please don't make us stay in there. It's going to kill us." To which the counselor sternly responded with, "That's impossible. Now quiet down and go to bed. This is the final time I'll say this." After 20 minutes of talking quietly, we all went to bed. Nothing else strange happened during the duration of the camp trip, and I had exchanged phone numbers with the girls. About a week after the camp trip had ended, I contacted both Angel and Brianna and asked them if they remembered that night, and they both said they did, and they said they'd never forget it. This was the very first experience I had with the paranormal. After the Bible camp incident, I had no more paranormal events. Until I was 14, that is. When these occurrences started, I would mostly just hear strange stuff, like someone scratching the walls outside my bedroom, screaming and growling, and footsteps, and sometimes what sounded like footsteps with long toenails dragging along the floor. Very creepy laughs that sounded like it came from someone with an incredibly deep voice, and occasionally something whispering my name into my ear. These noises used to be confined to outside my bedroom, but after a while, they'd always lead into my room. Very rarely would I ever see anything. It was mostly just audio. When I did see something, it was mainly a tall black hooded figure, either standing in my doorway or the foot of my bed. Sometimes I would feel something trying to grab my foot, or something running its fingers through my hair, which caused me to always keep the end of my blanket tucked under my feet for years. These occurrences would generally last all night until sunrise, but its peak hours were between 1 and 4 a.m. Sometimes things would occur even during the day. At age 14 one night, I was awoken by shuffling and noise coming from my dresser area. I'm a light sleeper. Any noise will wake me. And when I looked at my dresser, I saw a very tall hooded man, pitch black, going through my panty drawer. Even though I was completely terrified, I got the nerve to sit up in bed. The figure then turned completely around and acknowledged me in the room by staring at me for a few seconds before vanishing. For some reason I had no idea why, but I fell asleep after that with no problem at all. When I awoke in the morning, one of my pairs of bras were missing, as well as some of my underwear on the floor. Fast forward a few weeks, I was downstairs in the basement doing laundry and saw something hanging from a rusty nail on a support beam. And sure enough, it had been the bra that was missing. My mum's best friend Denise was over a few days ago to go blueberry picking with my mother during the summer. Denise brought with her about 20 packages of cosmetic removal wipes, which we put on the top of the towel cupboard outside the bathroom door. My mum decided she'd go grocery shopping with my dad to get food for supper, which left Denise and I in the house alone. Knowing that Denise was also sensitive to the paranormal, I began telling her about what had been happening in the house and what I had experienced. We decided to get up off the couch and walk towards my kitchen, and then we see our locked front door unlock itself and open without any force. Wide-eyed, we both look at each other. "Did you see that?" she said. I then walked to lock the front door. This incident got Denise pretty shaken up, and later on in the night I was lying in bed and started to hear a crinkly sound. The crinkly noise continued for a few minutes and it dawned on me that it was someone playing with the packages of makeup removal wipes on the top of the cupboard. All of a sudden, they all fall down onto the floor. My mum opens her bedroom door and goes to pick them up because she heard them fall too. It got eerily quiet for about 20 minutes, and then the crinkly sounds start again. All the wipes fell down, and not 5 seconds later, my bed was pushed into the wall really hard with me on it, causing me to scream bloody murder. My mother came running out of her room asking me what was wrong. I was crying and told her what happened, and she told me it was nonsense. I got out of bed, turned on the light, and pushed my bed away from the wall, when I noticed the wall was indented on the right side where the impact hit. I never push my bed right up against the wall. I always have my bed at least an inch away from the wall, because my power outlet is on the left side of my bed. I swear, these are all true. This all started when I left college. After getting my degree in journalism, I found my prospects of employment very slim indeed. I've always been quite a homely girl, and have never really liked being too far from my parents, being an only child. However, I knew that in order to find employment, I would have to brave the world and leave for one of the big cities near my small local town, probably moving there full time. So I sent out a bunch of resumes and got nothing back. I knew I would have to try harder. But it was summer, I'd recently graduated, and thought I'd enjoy my final summer of freedom before starting work in the adult world. My parents have always had a close family friend called Ray who owns a big camping spot in the woods. They needed counselors for the children going camping, and seeing as I'd been camping there many times in the past, I volunteered my services. The pay was okay, and the work was only for a few weeks and would definitely be enough to keep me going doing nothing all summer, just to give me time to send out resumes and chill with the girls. You know, the usual. So I called him up, and within 2 days my stuff had been packed up and I was ready to drive myself down to the camp. This was the first time that I had done the drive myself. I realized it was a lot longer when you had to do the drive instead of just play your Nintendo in the back. But still, it wasn't that bad. I arrived, set up myself in one of the dorms with some of the other counselors, and introduced myself. The children wouldn't be arriving for a few more days. They ran through some trainings with me, and we all got to know each other pretty well. The person who I got along best with was called Beth. She was studying at one of the local universities and told me all about her course, psychology, and we really struck a chord with each other and tried to keep our groups together during the camping sessions. But anyway, cut to a few weeks ahead. My troop and I are going on a little walk in the woods and just chit-chatting as we go along. We're making our way to one of the den areas, when suddenly one of the quieter girls of the group pipes up and asks if anyone's had trouble sleeping. Now, it's not uncommon for campers to have trouble sleeping out here. Number one, because they miss their parents, or because they're simply not used to or familiar with sleeping in tents. So, for me, it was a very normal thing to say. I bring her to my side and tell her that it's perfectly normal, explain what I just told you guys, and try and ease her down a little bit, and explain that it was all good. But she shakes her head and tells me that it was for none of those reasons that she feels a bit uncomfortable and had trouble sleeping. She told me it's because of the running at night. I give her a furrowed brow and ask her what she meant. She says that every other night since she's been here, so roughly 4 days, she's been woken up in the middle of the night by someone running. I found this very odd. I told her that there shouldn't be anyone out, but that if she wanted, I would stay out with her until she fell asleep, just to make sure that there was no one around. She agreed. That night, I stayed out. I made sure my campers were asleep, I was around the fire, and just cooking some marshmallows myself, chatting with Beth, my other counselor, and seeing if anything spooky would happen. I really doubted anything would happen, and nothing did, for the first hour. At this point I was getting tired, we were both getting bored, and our little marshmallow bag had run out painfully about half an hour ago, and we were just sitting there poking the dying embers of our fire, with topics for conversation slowly dying out. Just as we decided to put the fire out and make our way back to our own sleeping quarters, did we hear something in the forest? The sound of footsteps. I tell Beth to be quiet, and we look around. We can't see anything. There's still a fair bit of light from other campfires that are dying down as well. I look around, still nothing. So we make our way back quietly, keep looking over our shoulder. I get changed into my pajamas, and I'm about to fall asleep, but this thing is still bothering me. I still can't make out why I'm feeling so uncomfortable. I was sure that it was just an animal. So, I put my shoes back on in my pajamas and slowly creep outside. I'm just trying to make everything out in the dark, as I don't want to be seen or heard, and I sit behind a tree, and there's just enough light to make out a few shapes in the distance, all stationary so I know they're trees as well. While I wait, in the silence of darkness, do I hear something again, rustling further down. I wait patiently, seeing if whatever is there will emerge from the trees, exposing itself. Would it be a person or an animal? My cell phone was in my pocket, just waiting to dial the cops. It felt like an eternity, but there was no movement, and I was very close to giving up, when before long, I saw it. My phone at this point was in hand, waiting to press the power button to call the cops. But what I saw, I have no words for. This thing, hairy humanoid creature, emerged from behind a tree. Only for a split second was it stationary, as it pushed off the ground with its legs and ran at very high speeds. It ran so quickly through the woods, I barely had time to glimpse at it for more than a second. It was tall, incredibly tall, far too tall to be normal. It made very little sound as it ran, as it passed my campers and ran deep into the forest. I tried following it with my eyes, but it was too fast. And after a few minutes had passed, and I'd regained my composure, did I walk up to the tents of my campers. The girl from earlier who was scared was already out of her tent, and asked if I'd heard it. I told her that I had, but did not tell her what I had seen. I just said it was a deer, and to go back to sleep, and she gave me a weird look, and crawled back into her tent, to, I assume, fall asleep. I didn't sleep that night, and I didn't do a good job with the troop the next day. I really didn't want to stay much longer after that. I didn't want to see or hear that creature again, so I made no effort to stay out longer than I needed to, and tried to pass out before the time I suspected it would be out. Fortunately for me, I never saw or heard it again, and I couldn't have been happier to escape those woods and go back to civilization after those few weeks. I haven't been camping since, and never intend to do so again. I never did figure out what it was, but I think perhaps it's better that way. I went over to my boyfriend Ashton's grandparents' house. They live just outside of town in the country. His parents have a little camper out there, and we go there to sleep or just hang out for a day. He was making the fire while I was playing a video game with his little sister and brother. After the fire was started, I started to make s'mores for his brother and I. He asked me if I wanted to go to the woods with him and make a teepee. I wasn't too thrilled of the idea at first, because I just wanted to stay at the camper and make s'mores. His sister Serenity asked if she could come too, so I went with them. We started walking down this long path until we made a right turn heading into the woods. It was a hot summer's day, so I was wearing shorts and a tank top and my black Converse. Serenity and I followed him down a hill to the next road we were walking on and throughout the woods. He knew exactly where he was going. He said it would be a great place to make a teepee because it was hidden from the road and no one would see us nor the teepee. Ashton began to start building it while Serenity and I were gathering big sticks and putting them in a pile. When the teepee was made, it was about 6 o'clock, and we sat there, inside it, and began watching a movie from his phone. Once the movie was over, it was starting to get dark, so we decided to head back to the camper. That's when Serenity tripped over a big root and fell down, twisting her ankle and bashing her knee on the ground. Ashton tried to get her to her feet, but she couldn't do it. She was in so much pain. The teepee wasn't too far away, so we just headed back there to give Serenity a place to rest her foot for a little while. Ashton just set another fire while Serenity and I watched another movie on his phone. It was around 8 o'clock when the movie was done, and the fire had started to dwindle. Serenity ended up falling asleep. Ashton tried to wake her, but she didn't move. He didn't want to walk, because it was too dark to see, and he didn't want to trip over something, dropping Serenity on the ground or hurting himself. We opted to sleep there for the night and walk back early in the morning. We thought the quicker we fell asleep, the quicker morning would come, so we huddled up and fell asleep. We were all asleep when suddenly we heard a loud screaming sound. It sounded like a high-pitched screech. We all woke up, jumping out of our skin. I checked my phone, which was on 4%, and it was 3 a.m. Ashton sat right up and silently looked out. I was beside him. We were staring at the little door that he'd made of the teepee. It was too dark to even see anything, until we heard movement from outside. Then it went silent again, and then the movement returned. We heard another loud screech, and the branches outside breaking. Ashton reached for his wood knife and held it close to him, looking at the flap that was flapping ever so slightly. There was no wind at all, and the flap kept moving from side to side. I was hugging Serenity at this point, terrified to see what was going to happen next. Then we heard another loud screech right outside the teepee. Whatever that was, or whoever that was, screeched 5 or 6 more times until it finally stopped. After a while that felt like an eternity, it was nearly 6 a.m. The sun was almost out. Serenity couldn't take it anymore, and she really wanted to leave because she was petrified about the last night. We packed up our things and got out of there. Serenity's ankle still really hurt so badly that Ashton carried her for the rest of the way. When we got back, Ashton's dad came running to us, including his little brother, asking where we'd been and why we didn't return and if we were okay. We told him what happened and why we ended up sleeping in the woods. He told us we needed to leave now, so we all got in the car and went home. When we got to his dad's place, he seemed a bit shaken up. When he asked his dad what was up, his dad told him when we didn't come back from the woods later that day, he waited a little bit longer, and when night came, he called the police, and they came pretty fast. He told him that his son and daughter were missing along with the son's girlfriend, and the last place he'd seen us were when we were walking down the long road towards the bush. The officer then apparently told his dad to get inside and lock all the doors, and not to come back out until they got him. His dad was confused, but listened. A few hours went by, and that's when his dad heard the loud screeching sound coming from the woods. Then he heard it again and again, until it finally stopped. The officers returned at 4 a.m. and said they didn't find anything, but they did tell his dad why they told him to get into the house right away. There was someone who broke out of prison just a few miles down that road. The prisoner got out a few days ago and was still on the lookout. Turns out, he was convicted for taking people's lives. They thought he must have been hiding somewhere deep in the woods where no one would find him. His dad asked them what the loud screeching sound at 4 a.m. was, and the officers looked confused and asked what he was talking about. They ended up having to leave for another call. They told his dad to have a good day and that they would be back. Ashton's dad seemed very scared about the sound he heard. He didn't want us to think he was crazy, until Ashton told him he wasn't, because that night we heard the same thing, and someone was definitely outside our teepee that night. I'm just happy that nothing bad happened to us while we were out there. There was always something that I loved about the night time. The way that the cold air hit my skin, numbing my ears and tickling my nose. Golden rays from the headlights of passing cars danced within reflections in the surface of water puddles, turning pools of murky mess into glittering kaleidoscopes, if only for a moment. Looking up to the sky, to be greeted with such a speckled lagoon, a world that came alive through the darkness to watch over me as I explored the world. All of these things were magical, day after day. The sun presented itself to me as a white rabbit, insisting only that I follow it down the rabbit hole. I seldom resisted the urge, a fact that I would describe at this point to be reckless. You see, during the months that I had been indulging in this magical world of the night, I was only a girl of 14. My hometown is a quiet seaside village, quaintly populated with an electric mix of characters that I would not envision as threatening. I had lived in my neighborhood for the entirety of my life, and with that came a sense of immunity from the darker cracks of this community. The shady meetings in dark alleys with insidious intent. On this wintry afternoon, my head danced within the nebula of stars above me. I didn't think twice before turning from my road to the left in the direction of the nearby forest, which spanned miles into the mountains that rippled the landscape of surrounding towns. For clarity, the exit to my street had two directions. To the right, a road that connected my cul-de-sac to the rest of the town, laden with lights, houses, and the occasional shop. To the left was this secluded forest lane that travelled through the mountains and valleys that surrounded our town. It was a beautiful walk, continuing for miles as it stretched out like a vein. It was speckled with dim streetlights, causing the lane to exist between a strange state of light and dark, where your eyes twitched in a constant attempt to adjust to the bizarre hue. A flimsy wooden gate ran for the mile on the left side of the narrow lane, separating it from countless fields devoted solely to farming. On the right, the lane was sheltered by hedges, which broke occasionally to connect to small roads that led to the town. I can't remember how long I'd been walking this night. I don't know why I had chosen this forest lane, as I usually had better judgment than to stay too far from the sanctuary of houses and shops. The strongest memory of what happened that night is what came next. I must have been about 2 miles into my walk when a dark figure emerged from a break in the hedges to the right. I had not seen anybody on my trek thus far, and was automatically startled by this sudden appearance in front of me. The silhouette of this figure was small and hooded, standing no more than 20 feet ahead of me. I stopped in my tracks, watching as they scoured the length of the lane to each side of them, before noticing me. As soon as the figure caught sight of me, they took a jaunty lurch in my direction. It seemed like a limp initially, although it was inconsistent in which limb was causing such pain. Fluctuating from right to left, I struggled to make out any features of this person, their features hidden in the depths of a thick hood lined with fur. I stepped back cautiously as they approached me. A voice within me screamed to just run, sprint away, and to go home. However, there was something louder within me that recognized that this person could be hurt. Something about them just didn't seem right, and I was torn as to which part of my judgment to commit to. "Emily?" The voice was shrill, desperate and female. The woman stopped in her tracks as she noticed my retreat. I paused hesitantly. Under the approaching streetlight, I could see the brief outlines of the face under the hood. Her features looked gaunt, worn and exhausted. Dark eyes scoured the details of my own face, empty in their depths as they searched for something, the object of which I would only assume was Emily. "I'm sorry," I shouted across the short distance between us. "I'm not Emily." Her brow furrowed as her eyes flickered with something akin to anger for a brief moment. "I can't find my Emily." I hesitated again, finding myself caught between the two voices inside me. "I haven't seen anyone down this path," she sobbed. "How long have you been walking?" "About 2 miles. I haven't seen anyone in that time." "Are you with anyone? They might have seen Emily." The question struck me as odd. I was alone before her, the path being linear enough that she could detect that I was alone. Alarm bells began to screech within my mind. "I don't know where Emily is, but maybe you'd better look in the other direction." "Why should I do that?" It seemed that a small smile danced around the corner of her lips. It happened over a fraction of a second, but it was enough to shake me into slowly stepping away from this woman. My feet crunched under the gravel, the sound reverberating between us. It caught the woman's attention, and she began her own predatory journey towards me. My heart thumped in my chest, filling up my ears with a rhythmic thud. I began to feast upon every detail of her face, aware of the danger before me, and refusing to withdraw my stare for even a second. "I don't know anything about Emily," I yelled, terror now possessing me. "Leave me alone." She didn't respond. The smile that possessed her features was heart-wrenchingly sinister. It was a smirk with no amusement, just a hollow emptiness that reflected in the void of her eyes. No expression, no life, just darkness. As she continued to step towards me, I knew that I had to run. Without pausing for another thought, I turned on my heels. And that's when I saw him. Within an arm's reach of me, a towering man had been approaching me from behind. The same evil glint tarnished her face, but I didn't allow myself another moment to absorb the details. I ran harder and faster than I ever had before. The ferocity of my feet against the hard path sent shockwaves throughout my body, heart hammering in its overbearing desire to survive. I screamed, trying to draw the attention of anyone who could be listening. I didn't know how close they were to me. I didn't want to look. I continued my sprint straight down the path for about a mile, before taking a sharp turn to the left and thundering my way towards the first signs of life. I found refuge in a newsagent's. The small shop was quiet, occupied by an elderly shopkeeper. My arrival startled him as I threw myself behind the shelter of shelves and began to sob hysterically. The next few hours were a blur to me, and I remember only the wave of relief as he took me into the back room of the shop, comforting me whilst calling the police and my parents. Nothing ever came from the investigation of the police. I spoke to them twice on the matter, but to no avail. My parents swung between states of relief and rage, and I can't say I blame them. I dread to think what would have happened that night, and even now, I have nightmares of how close those hands were. All the while, I stepped closer and closer to them. I'm sure that many people have experienced many dangerous and volatile situations. I understand that this experience could have ended so much worse for me. For that, I'd like to say this is more of a cautionary tale from the reflections of a girl who fancied herself a vagabond, but was actually a lamb, striding straight into a pack of wolves. Always be careful, be safe, and never underestimate the danger around you. I was car camping with friends on the Oregon coast at a designated site in the woods. While I was carrying firewood, our camp neighbor came up and offered to help, and then introduced himself to the group. We invited him over for a beer, and it turns out his name was Jason, and he was a retired boat cook who used to work on fishing ships in Alaska, but now he's traveling the west coast and staying in campgrounds. Jason was kind of a quiet guy, but as the night went on, he started to get a bit off, acting suspiciously, not really interacting with anyone, staring off into space, and then getting up, walking 2 steps and sitting down again. It started to get pretty late, and we were all getting ready to go to bed. I usually sleep outside in a sleeping bag without a tent unless it's raining or something, so I set up my sleeping bag a little ways away from the fire and pass out. I woke up to Jason standing over me with a weird look on his face and my friends freaking the hell out. It turns out they all thought he stumbled back over to his campsite, but instead, he went over to me and started stumbling / trying to roll me out of my sleeping bag. I was super pissed off at this point, and tired, and we kicked him out of our campsite while I went to sleep in my friend's tent. Now at this point, I feel that I have to say that these might seem like warning signs, but the Pacific Northwest has some very strange and unstable people, so we honestly didn't think much of it beyond some weirdo getting too drunk and perhaps lost. The next day we all piled into a car to explore the town, and as we leave we see Jason sitting at his campsite, just staring at a lantern across from him. We're gone for about 3 hours, and when we return, Jason is still there, staring at this lantern. We were all making dinner later, when he comes over to our camp with a bottle of vodka and apologized for being so weird the night before. My friend accepted his apology and offered him a burrito, and Jason proceeds to start drinking the vodka and eating with us. Completely different guy. He seems really embarrassed and sorry for the night before. As the night progresses, he's getting quiet again, but I honestly thought at this point perhaps he's just down on his luck. Maybe a touch of alcoholism, and probably pretty harmless. Plus, he wouldn't take a hint to leave. After dinner, I was sitting on a log with my back to the woods, facing the fire, and my friends were all arranged around the campfire on chairs on the other side. Jason was sitting on the log next to me on my right, between me and the group. We're all having a great time and laughing, and as the night goes on, Jason is getting progressively more quiet and seems really angry. Around midnight, I glance over and notice that he's mumbling under his breath. Now I'm the only one close enough to him to sense this change, and I start to try to figure out what he's saying. I follow his gaze and notice that he's staring intently at the axe to the left of me. I didn't want to spook him by moving, but it's about this time that I hear what he's saying, and he's talking about stabbing us all with his knife, over and over again. He's got this really glazed look as he says that he's going to end us. I lock eyes with my friends across the fire, and he notices that something is really wrong and stands up, and I grab the axe and run as fast as I can to the other side of the fire. Jason gets up and starts to run towards us, and my friend, who's a big guy, grabs a hold of him while my other friends take his knife from him. We debated packing up and leaving, but ended up escorting him back to his campsite and sitting in the car until morning when we could report it. The next day at sunrise, when I head over to the camp ranger station, I noticed Jason was completely gone, with all his stuff, even though he'd already paid for 6 more days. I've done my share of deeper backcountry stuff, and seen bears, heard strange noises, and was stalked by a cougar more than once. But to this day, the only experience I've had in the woods that made me wish I had a gun was this one. It was the second to last night at my camp. This night and the next were usually reserved for this thing called a shepherd watch. It was a Christian camp, which is where the kids and counselors take shifts through the night to watch the fire and such, just like shepherds did with their sheep. This night, my watch was from 11 PM to 1 AM, and I wasn't really dreading it, as I'm used to staying up late anyway. So, to give you a visual for my location, the camp is located on a lake and a small mountain. The mess hall, main office, and other buildings are down at road level, and the cabins are up on the mountain spaced apart from each other. The youngest kids got the cabins closest to the bottom, and the older kids got the further ones. I was a sophomore in high school at the time, and so my campsite was a little past halfway up. Another thing you have to understand is that the camp is in the woods. You have to drive off the main turnpike down a dirt road for 2 miles before you actually get to camp. So as you imagine, we were surrounded by wildlife and lots of it. It's about 7 PM, and the sun is just about to go down, and my group of campers and another group were down at the family camp, which is meant for the daycare service people for little kids, or a place to bring tents and camp out with your family, as it wasn't just a summer camp. It's a big open meadow with a large picnic area in the center. We were playing manhunt, which is kind of like hide and seek mixed with tag, and me and my friend Dom were way off in the woods, Probably a lot further than we needed to be really, when we started to hear what sounded like dozens of footsteps. The faint barks and howls confirmed my guess that it was a pack of coyotes roaming around this area. Needless to say, we were a little nervous, but I had been out in the woods enough times to know that they wouldn't really bother us unless provoked or rabid, and since they were in a pack, that ruled out the latter. We started to jog back towards the camp, when out of nowhere chaos explodes behind us. The pack had encountered something that it either attacked or attacked it. We froze in our tracks and listened to the sound of yelping, barking, growling and howling, followed by the sound of flesh being ripped off something. The entire camp could no doubt hear what was going on just outside the play area, where dozens of kids are roaming around. So the counselors decided it would be a perfect time to blow their emergency whistles and get all the kids away from the snarling, bloodthirsty canines, just a few hundred yards away from me and Dom. While the two of us were sprinting through the woods trying to get back to safety, I swear that I could hear something coming up from behind us. Not only that, but I could feel something behind us. I didn't dare turn around to check, for fear of tripping over a stick or root and letting whatever was behind us catch up. I just screamed to run faster, and we eventually made it out of the tree line and back to the group. I asked Dom if he saw anything behind us. He says that he didn't see anything, but definitely felt something there. Later that night, the two groups, including mine, made their way up to a big fire pit, complete with rudimentary benches fashioned from logs and put into a half circle around the fire pit. It even had its own cabins, if the camp had more programs running for kids there. The campers were tasked with gathering firewood for an all-nighter, so everyone was out in the dark woods with nothing but a flashlight and hopefully a buddy carrying armloads of firewood. I was more or less self-appointed to making the actual fire, mostly because I make huge fires, and I started with a simple small log cabin-style build, and slowly built outwards from it until I was using sticks that were about 5 feet in length and 5 to 6 inches in diameter. So it was pretty impressive, maybe a little too massive. While all of this was going on, I couldn't stop thinking of what had happened earlier, and every time I thought about when we felt as if something were chasing us, my heart would start thumping, and I would feel as though the creature were right behind me. At around 9 p.m, I heard the coyote pack again. I've heard many packs and single dogs howling, but I have never heard a pack like this. It was full of anger and hate. It was spewed forth into the night air like they were on a mission to kill. They had an objective, and nothing was going to stand in their way. It started out from what sounded like a few miles away, possibly on a neighboring peak. The thing is, coyotes travel fast. I alerted one of the senior counselors, saying that we shouldn't do a shepherd watch because the pack is still around here. He tells me not to worry, that they won't come near us and that they're miles apart. I really wish that were true. All the kids started singing camp songs and telling stories. I was sitting on a log, staring into the forest at about 9:45, when I heard them again, but this time they were closer. By 10:30, everyone is done singing songs and making s'mores, and they just head off to their cabins for the night. And the group that had the 11 to 1 watch just decided to stay by the flames. The group of me, Dom, and Ashley, who was a girl from our cabin, and 2 girls and a boy from another camp group, I think his name was Dimitri. Dom gets up to grab more firewood from the ever-dwindling supply. As he gets to the pile, he leaps backwards and falls to the ground, yelping in terror. I spring up and run over to him, flashlight in hand, and I see it. It's a baby deer, or rather the head of one. I can assure you that it wasn't there earlier due to the fact that the pile had been trampled all over throughout the night, and as more kids had been collecting wood. Even more so due to the fact that the blood was still oozing from its freshly torn neck. Whatever had done this was most certainly not a coyote. There was a ping-pong ball-sized wound right above the ripping point of the neck of the ill-fated fawn, so I guess that thing was very, very big indeed. I dragged Dom to his feet and pushed him back towards the fire circle, screaming at the counselor that we needed to leave now, or else we wouldn't make it through the night. I knew this was dramatic, but I was distressed at the time, so bear with me. And as I'm about to start putting the fire out, I see them. Dozens of pairs of eyes running all around, just on the light's edge, poised to strike. All sounds stop. All I hear is the deafening silence as fear courses through me. I have never been more scared in my life, but somehow I manage to run to the woodpile and grab an armful of firewood and throw it onto the fire. I tell everyone to grab their stuff and go, and tell them to run into the cabin that was there, grab a stick that looked strong but lightweight enough to swing, and run after the rest of the group. As I'm about to start stepping up onto the steps of the cabin, I hear the sound of something running towards me. Without thinking, I turn around and swing at whatever it was, just narrowly missing its head. In the dim moonlight and the stretching arms of the firelight, I saw that it wasn't a coyote, and I honestly don't know to this day what it was. I hope what I saw wasn't real, and that it was just a trick of the light. Deep down though, I think I know what I saw, but there are some things that I might just rather forget. The stories I'm about to share with you happened at the same Boy Scout camp. They were some years apart, and I don't think they have anything to do with each other. In any case, I've always felt a little uneasy about that camp, especially while swimming. To be more clear, I felt like I would be pulled underwater at any moment out of nowhere. But my stories have nothing to do with the lake. A friend of mine had bought a large tent with 2 rooms, the rooms situated where you had to go through one to get out the other. My friend who owned the tent and another friend set their cots and stuff up in the front room. I set mine up in the back alone. It had been a few days in, and things were for the most part going smoothly, earning merit badges and swimming. But that night, I won't forget for a second. It was late, and everyone went to bed. I had gone outside the tent to go to the bathroom. The camp had these bugs that liked to make a lot of noise at night. But 2 minutes after I got back in and laid on my cot, they stopped, and it was dead silent, and that's when I heard it. It sounded like a snort, not like a pig or anything, like a predator. I also began to hear whatever it was walk, and it sounded huge and bipedal. It stopped around the tent and began to move further into the center of our campsite and continued stomping and snorting. All I could do was listen in fear, hoping it didn't get the incentive to rip into the tent. Then it stopped, and the sound of the bugs returned. I never did go out to find out what it was. All I did was lay there and hope it didn't return. Next morning I told my troop, and when I did everyone laughed at me, and my scoutmasters made it worse by telling me I had a wild imagination. The other friends I shared the tent with believed me though. One said it could have been a raccoon, but I've heard raccoons before, and it doesn't sound like what I've heard. My second story took place while I was staff. I was much older, and being on staff can be much more fun and relaxing compared to being a camper. Less rules, you don't get told what to do, and you get to stay out there longer and have a week to yourself with your own campsite and pre-built tent platforms in a row. That said, it comes with its downsides too. This time you're the one who teaches the merit badges, and you now know why some staff don't get along that well with the kids. We'd been a few weeks into the camp, and one night I had decided to go to the parking lot, relieve some stress and smoke a cigar, as the parking lot was the designated smoking area. Now, I'm not great at measurements. Imagine a really large gravel parking lot with 4 woods on each side and a road in the right corner leading away from camp. Before you get to the parking lot, there's a wall with a gate for cars. I decide to sit up against the wall in the parking lot alone. It was windy and I had trouble getting the cigar lit, when I got the odd feeling that I was being watched. I scanned the tree line. When I saw it to the left, behind a few trees was an odd red light. It wasn't large enough to illuminate anything large because the area was quite dark. It looked red like the numbers on an alarm clock, but it was brighter too. I shrugged it off, thinking maybe it was just a light on a power pole or something, so I continued trying to light my cigar. When it got lit, I felt a little relieved, but the feeling of being watched did not go away. I scanned the tree line again, but didn't find anything of interest. I stared at that red light for a few moments, and that's when it hit me. There was nothing in that direction for light to be there. So I grabbed my things and left. I thought I saw the light move. It didn't seem like a light, more like a sinister eye. When I got to my feet, a feeling that I should run for my life hit me so hard, and I bolted, over the wall and across the camp. It's not like anyone was up. No one was going to slow me down or help me out. I headed for the cafeteria, which was the largest building, because I knew the lights would be on and the doors would be unlocked. So I went in there and laid down on some chairs to calm down. I threw up in the trash can and a friend walked in and found me there and walked me back to my tent. The next morning I asked the leader in my area if there was anyone over there that would have a red light for any reason and have it turned on at night. To my dismay, he thought it was someone with a red flashlight up to no good. That was my first year on staff. My second year had nothing of note, and I'd never seen or heard anything like that since. And honestly, I certainly hope that nothing like that ever happens again. This happened near a place we go camp and canoe in the summer, late one night. My fiancée and I got a call from a good friend of ours, and she needed us to retrieve a canoe of hers. The problem was, the canoe was sitting on a beach at the end of her road by some bushes, which were right behind her crazy brother's house. Previously, this psychopathic brother had threatened us with an axe when we went down to the beach to use the canoe, so we decided that it would be best to return under the cover of night. We parked at the top of the road, which is a very steep hill, and we slowly crept down so as to not set off the neighbor's motion-activated lights. My brother's house was right at the bottom of the hill, and he had been able to see us creeping along the woods if we were to light ourselves up. As we neared the bottom, we noticed a few lights still on in the brother's house, so we sat down in the middle of the road and lit up a cigarette each, waiting for him and his wife to go to bed. This road is in the middle of a private community, far out in the woods, so we had no expectations that anyone would be driving by, and sitting in the road besides the woods, no one nearby could see nor hear us. As we waited, we began to hear a loud rustling in the woods behind us. We watched, and in the deep darkness we saw a cat step out by the stone wall, right near the road we were sitting on. A large, wild cat. It was so dark we weren't sure what exactly it was, but the moment it saw us, it went from a loud approach to making absolutely no sound at all. By the time we had the balls to shine a light on it, it had somehow slinked back into the woods, far enough back that all we could see was the glare off its eyes, and it hid its body behind a fallen tree. We figured we scared it away. Eventually, psycho canoe-stealing brother and his wife shut off their lights and are in bed. The fiancé and I creep the rest of the way down the road to the beach and over to the area that's just behind this guy's house to retrieve the canoe. We notice he has a lot of windows open on his house, so we decide to smoke some cigarettes and wait a bit, so that he has time to drift off to sleep before we sneak the canoe back up to his sister's house. We think we hear something in the woods. Perhaps it's just our imaginations. We realize that nearly everything is silent. We're right by a lake, but there are no insects, no frogs, nothing making noise in the woods, and that's not normal. And I begin having this overwhelming feeling of being watched from the bushes, that the canoe is inconveniently tucked just beneath. We've waited a while, and I needed to pee bad. I go over to the bushes, and as I get close, something runs right towards me and stops maybe 10 feet back in the bushes. We can't see anything. Frogs start screaming nearby, and the danger call goes all around the pond. We can hear crunching in the bushes the entire time, but as soon as the call stops, so does the crunching around us in the trees by the bushes. This goes on for a while. Every time we're moving around or talking, we can hear something moving around us, but the second we quiet down, it goes silent. Supposedly there are no mountain lions in this area, but we see hunters posting videos from their trail cams regularly. At this time we didn't think of this, but eventually we decide that we're being stalked by something, and it's better we don't shoulder an 100-pound canoe and try to hike up a steep hill, especially since I weigh about as much as the canoe, and would be easy pickings if I were hunted. We book it back to our car, all the while something is following us in the woods. Silent when we stop, but we can hear it out of sync with our steps when we're walking. We make it to the car, hop in, and back down the driveway full of adrenaline. Finally, feeling slightly safe after 45 minutes of sensing we were being followed, and off in a clearing of the woods through the ferns, we can see the eyes reflecting at us, maybe 3 or so feet off the ground. We have no confirmation of what it was, but it just confirmed that we had been followed from the time we smoked in the road until the time that we made it back to the car. I live in a 16-foot camper. Before the rest of my family moved here, this was my research vehicle. I researched the history of human habitation in Colorado, so this camper has been everywhere. I've been to the harsh southeastern canyonlands, stepped out the door in the morning to find a herd of wild horses in the northwest, and endured severe storms on the short grass prairie. For a while, I took it to the US-Mexico border and lived on the grounds of a museum and battle site in the Chihuahua Desert. I'd been there for quite a bit, and at 2 a.m. I heard and felt an impact on my roof, just over my bed, and claws, big claws. I've seen Jeepers Creepers. I know how this works. Anyway, I just laid there, terrified, listening to something very big attempt to peel my camper like a tin can. About an hour later, it went away. In the morning I did snake patrol. Just before winter, a lot of rattlesnakes, lizards and such try to move into the museum, and when I looked at my camper, I saw blood on the roof and scratches. The small critters of the desert took care of a lot of whatever it was, so I didn't have much to wash off by the time I finished snake patrol. One thing I love and miss about the Chihuahua is its simplicity and efficiency. Everything has a role. Humans are just animals with fancy dens. Even if I am to be eaten by a chupacabra, it doesn't seem bizarre, because I'm living in a place where the bizarre is normal. So I went to bed that night, and the next, without much worrying about my imminent demise. A couple of nights later, it happened again. 2 a.m. Thunk, claws, scrabbling. Jesus. This thing spans the entire width of my camper. Claws scrabbling. Me, terrified. The thing goes away an hour later, and there's blood on my camper roof. The next night, thunk, claws, my camper roof being pummeled. Weird sounds. And then, thunk, on the other end of my roof, and the sound of claws coming closer to the roof over my bed. I ran out of the door, frantically unlocking my truck. From the safety of my truck, I looked back at my camper. The male owl looked on from my roof as a female owl devoured his furry, very dead offering. He lived in the water tower. She lived across the border near a feedlot. My camper roof was the only patch of white within plain view of her community. He'd been demonstrating his abilities to hunt and kill for a week, bringing half-dead prey to the roof, letting it escape over and over, and pinning it down over and over. Finally, on this night, he wooed her. It was so sweet, I never minded cleaning up the blood after that. It only lasted another week, and then I saw them together at the water tower. When I was around 9 years old, I had 2 of my friends stay over to play and hang out. I was just a little girl who lived in a small neighborhood in a small town. But our neighborhood was full of either elderly couples or young couples with new families and kids to play with. The girls I were hanging out with that day lived in my neighborhood as well, and were the same age as me. My neighborhood was looped into a circle with a cul-de-sac at one end of a little street connected to the circle. My friends and I would always walk down the cul-de-sac because there was a little trail that went into the woods, with a little rustic bridge over a small stream. We also had discovered our way from the woods into a whole different cul-de-sac of neighboring nearby neighborhoods, so we liked to walk through to the other side. Recently they started construction in the woods, and there were a couple of new clearings full of dirt piles to make way for some new houses there. That day, it was super muddy. It rained the night before, and we all wore rubber rain boots. We started off down the path, stopping at the bridge. I had just gotten a new digital camera, and we were taking our 2007 version of a selfie together on the bridge. We all thought this was super fun, because especially at this age, none of us really had our own cameras or phones, although I had a little flip phone in case of an emergency that my mum had insisted I bring with me on our walk. After the group pictures and blurry pictures of the forest, we kept going down the paths. They weren't really paths so much as deer trails that we'd memorized from being through these woods so many times. Eventually we came to a clearing where they just cleared out to prepare for construction. As we were all climbing the giant piles of dirt and sand, outstretching our arms at the top, pretending we were kings of the world, as we looked around at the view from above, I snapped a few pictures of the woods from my vantage point, and we laughed as the dirt beneath one of our friend's feet gave way, and she slid down the dirt hill on her butt, and we joked that it looked like she had had an accident. We were just easygoing, innocent kids that had fun over the little things. That's what I'm getting at. Eventually we decided to venture back home, and we were walking down one of the little trails. I've always had good intuition. As we were walking, suddenly I felt my stomach flip-flop, and I froze in my path, looking around nervously. It just felt like we were being watched. My friends heard my footfalls cease and looked back at me asking, "What's the matter? What are you doing?" I shushed them and gestured at them to stop with my hand. We all froze and looked around, but none of us saw anything, and eventually one of the girls broke the silence. "There's nothing here. Come on, let's go." I couldn't shake the feeling though. Uneasily I followed them and walked ahead of them protectively, since it seemed like only I could sense there was trouble. But then I stopped in my tracks as we rounded a corner. I saw two grown men facing us, head on along the path we were walking. They were each carrying something. I only looked briefly, but it looked as if one of them was either carrying a chainsaw or a normal saw, and the other one had a hammer or small metal bat. One was wearing a black t-shirt, and the other one a blue long sleeve. I told my friends to run, and we turned around, sprinting down the path that we'd just taken, boots splattering the mud on our pants. I looked back, still running, and they were still following us, but it seemed as if they didn't know the woods as well as we did. I said, "Quick, run to the other neighborhood," and we kept going, weaving through the trees and bushes and thorns. It was like a cliché movie scene, as one of my friends fell, and we frantically, scared, helped her get up and kept running. Eventually we could see the trees were thinning as we neared the other cul-de-sac, and we ran through, our feet finally hitting glorious pavement. We didn't stop though. We kept booking it through the neighborhood. Eventually, when we got far enough away, we turned around, looked at the entrance of the woods, and the two men were just standing there. They hadn't entered the neighborhood, likely because it was more public than the woods, but we could see the blue shirt from where we stood. The neighborhood we were in now is about a 10-minute drive from my house on a main road, which is why we liked taking the woods since there weren't any sidewalks. However, being 9 years old, and fearing that they'd follow us anyway through the woods, we got onto the main road and called my mum. Eventually she collected us. We were all shocked and crying a little, and my mum called the cops. They searched the area, but never found any sign of them. The thing is, there's never anyone in the woods. Maybe they were construction workers, but there wasn't any construction going on with the mud, and it wasn't even nearly ready to go into the building process. They'd only started clearing the woods, and they were also carrying things that could be used as weapons. The only freaky thing that proved they had bad intentions were the fact that they chased us, 3 9-year-old girls, through the woods with weapons, and I'd had that gut feeling. Thank God my mum made me bring my cell phone on our walk. Also, we'd later gone through my camera of the pictures we'd taken, and in the photo with the high vantage point, you could see a black boot, 1 leg, and a blue long-sleeved arm coming from behind a tree, when you zoomed into a spot on the background. No face was visible though, so they'd been watching us for a while that day too. We were lucky to have known the area, but dear 2 men who chased us through the forest? Let's not meet. I starved at a boys' summer scout camp in southeast Missouri, nestled on a huge and mostly unused property surrounded by the Ozark/Mark Twain National Forest. Just a few minutes outside the property is a small hilltop park converted from a retired forest ranger's fire tower. It's got wooden stairs that lead about halfway up to the tower to an enclosed platform that you can observe the landscape for a few miles over. It was often frequented by other staffers on their respective nights off, and sometimes you'd run into some less than savory locals that mostly used it for debauchery. It was a popular place among staffers as it provided a tranquil and relaxing space to just chill out, away from the chaos that is camp. I have been there many times in the 2 years prior to my third summer. It was always a normal and quiet place. So, one Saturday evening, on my third year, my girlfriend at the time was visiting. I wanted to take her to all the cool spots, so after dinner and a movie, I took her to the fire tower. It wasn't super late, although it was the darker side of twilight. But when we arrived, we were the only ones there. Although not out of the ordinary, this was slightly unusual, as the camps on the property shared Saturday nights off, outside of special weekend events we hosted once or twice a summer. Thinking nothing of it, I told my girlfriend I just wanted to sit in the truck for a minute. I had a '94 Chevy S10 with a sick turquoise camper shell. We rolled down the windows and enjoyed the cool evening summer breeze. Not a minute or two later, my girlfriend asks me, "Hey, what's that noise?" And I perk up, because I hadn't noticed anything at all. I'm straining to listen to some sort of foreign sound, when I hear what sounds like drum beats being produced from mid-air in a big ring around the car. The individual beats would sound at different distances and elevations, with no discernible rhythmical pattern. It sounded a lot like the drums from In the Deep from Fellowship of the Rings. We were both sitting there, a little bewildered, when I started to scan the area for the source of the noise. I looked up and down the tower to see if anyone's needlessly stomping their feet as hard as possible on the wooden steps, creating an echoing noise. Nobody. I looked down at the little bench area at the bottom of the tower. Nothing. I checked the parking lot again to see if somehow I missed another parked vehicle on our way in. Nope. We were the only ones there. By this point, I know that something weird is going on, and I roll up the windows and lock the door. My girlfriend is still confused, but she's never been here before, so she doesn't realize how unnatural this sound is. The drum beats have picked up, and it seems like they're slowly but steadily closing in on the truck, progressively getting louder. The hair on my arms and neck stands up straight, as I can tell the beats are actually approaching us in the truck. All of a sudden, I hear the beat right behind the camper shell window, right behind the cab of the truck. I fling myself around to see if there's anything in the bed of the truck, but I see nothing. However, as soon as I turn over my right shoulder to look back, I expose my back to the driver's side window, and immediately, a drum beat happens just outside my window. Just remembering this, I get chills down my back, as if whatever was doing this was intentional and intelligent. It picked the bed first because my back was exposed and vulnerable, got me to turn around, and it was as if it was taunting me. At this point, dread washed over me, and I felt like we needed to leave immediately, or we'd be in some serious danger. My fight or flight kicked in so hard I began to cry uncontrollably, flying down the gravel road, way too fast to be safe. The noise did not pursue nor continue. But needless to say, when we got back to camp, I was so shaken I had to go straight to bed. I've been back a few times since, but nothing like this has ever happened again. I asked some other camp staff buddies if they had experienced or heard anything similar like this at the fire tower, but nobody had anything noteworthy to say. My ex-girlfriend still remembers that night, but maintains that she never felt any fear, just a curiosity of what was making that noise. If anyone has any thoughts or ideas, I'm open to hearing what you think. I was working in the Czech Republic, at kids' summer camps when I was 20. It was nothing like the American summer camps that I've seen on TV. It was far more relaxed. We owned a huge cabin in the forest just outside a small town. There were walking tracks around, and people could walk past our cabin and field area from time to time. One time, I was doing some craft with a small group of children at a table that can be seen from the walking tracks when this guy walks by. He's about 30, had dreadlocks, and is alone, wearing heavy boots, these patchwork pants, and a loose metal signet. He stops mid-walk when he spots us and begins to approach. He asks me in Czech if I have any cigarettes. I tell him that I don't speak Czech very well, in an attempt for him to give up and leave. I'm trying to be nice because I have 5 kids here sitting at the table and I don't want to scare them. He then switches to English. It was like a 50-50 chance he wouldn't speak English in this part of the country, and he begins commenting on my tattoos as I have a sleeve. He's asking me all this stuff, saying he's getting a new one, asking about the cigarettes again, and I say no. I was being polite about the tattoos, but I'm not encouraging this conversation. He asks me my name, and I tell him, which keeps him talking for a bit, and after a while he moves on. I sigh with relief, and the day continues. Later that afternoon, it was around 6. The light is still out, and we were killing time before dinner was being served. I was in the field outside the cabin with some kids running around. Other leaders were doing various activities with kids, when all of a sudden another leader got my attention and told me to get the kids inside. I look up on either side of the field where the trees start, and there are guys all dressed similarly to the guy earlier, standing just back from the tree line. They'd spread out in different angles, and then I hear someone shout my name. We move all the kids inside and lock the doors. The 3 male leaders we have go out to speak to the guys in the forest surrounding our cabin. I hear them say, "We're here hunting for deer. Thought we saw it coming through this way. Anyway, I'm a friend of," and then he says my name. I start freaking out. I can't believe it's the same guy from the morning. He says, "I want to show her my new tattoo." Confused, the leaders come back and are like, "Who are these guys?" They know I'm not Czech, and I don't know many people outside our circle, so I know it's odd. I tell them about the morning and that I don't want to see him again. They go back out and tell these guys to leave after some fuss and yelling. The rest of the trip, I was paranoid that they'd return, especially at night. Luckily for me, they didn't. When I was younger, my dad would tell me this story about something that happened to him and my older brother when my brother was very young. I never had any reason to doubt that this was true, but you know how it is. You remember something from your childhood, and so you dig a little deeper. I independently researched this when I was older, and it is completely true. My aunt had just been physically abused by her husband at the time, and so my older sister, who was an infant at the time, and my mum, pregnant with me, were with her. My brother was around 5 and stayed with my dad, who decided to take him camping on the Appalachian Trail as a special treat. My dad worked in law enforcement at the time, which ties into the story. Where I live, there are multiple roads that access the Appalachian Trail, so my dad took my brother to a portion of the trail that leads to a trail shelter, not more than 2 miles in. When the 2 of them arrived at the campsite, they decided to leave the shelter vacant and pitch a tent, which is polite to do for through hikers. There was only one other camper near the shelter, which is not that uncommon given how close the shelter was to the road. My dad decided to introduce himself to the other single male camper, mentioning that he works in law enforcement. The guy was clearly off, but as of yet was in no way nefarious towards them. He did, however, have a very large hunting utensil that he left out, clearly visible and very dangerous. As it began to get dark, the other camper began to behave more strangely. He would look over at my dad and brother and stare, as if he had something to say, and then look back. My dad did everything he could to engage the guy in conversation, but again the man just behaved oddly. My dad picked up on this, so decided to pull out his concealed weapon and place it within view. After 2 hours of staring and creeping, the guy approached my dad with a smaller hunting utensil, not threateningly but as if to give it as a present. My dad naturally looks at this gesture with confusion. The man says, "Hey, take this." "No," my dad says. "No, really, take it." "No." A few more rounds of this back and forth. "I mean it, take it, you're gonna need it tonight," the guy says, deadpan, locking eyes with my dad. My dad doesn't know what to say, but the guy walks away and leaves it by the ring of fire. My dad has my brother, a younger child, with him and is naturally terrified. He decides that despite it being dark, it's high time to promptly get the hell out of the campsite. So with my brother close by, he packs up the tent, packs up his pack, which takes him about half hour in the dark. My dad is about to leave when the guy sees him. He picks up the hunting utensil, holding it as if to attack, and approaches my dad. My dad has his flashlight pointed directly at the guy, sensing that something was about to go down. "I want you to fight me," the guy growls, locking eyes, with about 10 feet between him and my dad and brother. My dad grabs his firearm, aims it, and basically tells the guy to step down. He tells my brother to grab the pack, which has a seat on it, to hold a young child. My dad puts the pack on. He hands my brother the flashlight and tells him to get on his back. At first he backs up the trail with the weapon trained on the guy, and my brother pointing the flashlight at him. The guy slowly approaches, but then stops just before my dad pulls the trigger. My dad decides he's gonna run, and tells my brother to shine the flashlight on the trail and let him know if he sees anyone following. Clearly dangerous in the near dark on a wooded trail, but it was that, or leave my brother with no flashlight. My dad runs all the way back to the car, hightails it out of there, and goes home to call my mum and put my brother in bed. He also calls the police. The next day, my dad hears that the guy went to a bar after the encounter and started talking about it. He then, oddly enough, went to the cops to say that my dad had assaulted him with a firearm, at which point the police got him for questioning. Upon following up an investigation over a few months, they found out that the guy was bipolar but wasn't on his meds and didn't actually mean my dad or brother any harm. When the guy saw the firearm and heard he was in law enforcement, he decided he basically wanted to end his life by cop. My dad went through a lot of counseling for this afterwards, which was always interesting to hear because when you hear these danger stories from people, you never hear about the aftermath. The guy wound up in jail for a short period of time. Anyway, I hope for the best for the guy, because I understand that he suffered from mental illness. But still, it's creepy, and I'd rather not meet again. I've got a good through-hiking crew. We've done pieces of the Appalachian Trail, some Florida swamp, and a good amount in Maine. We consider ourselves pretty experienced. 2 of us are military. The other 2 are just fun to have around. So with that said, we emphasize preparation. This was probably 2015. We planned a 10-day trip in West Virginia, along a river the weeks after Christmas. This is our favorite time to camp, because 1, we're all home, 2, bugs aren't around, and 3, no one else is stupid enough to camp at that time of year. We've done the trail before and felt comfortable with the forecast. Highs in the low 30s, lows in the teens, nothing we couldn't handle. We set off. Weather is great. The trail we're on is a 26-mile loop, handrailing a river most of the way. We eventually get to the spot we mapped out on the second day, about 14 miles in, and get ready to chill and do man stuff for the week. We rock out of the woods doing the usual for us, cutting wood, hopping into the river, hunting, fishing, writing and the like. Now we've been out there before, and have explored perhaps a 3x3 square grid radius, and we didn't hear or sense the presence of anyone else near there. Things start to get gnarly. I'll get into the paranormal first though. It's 5 a.m. and we start getting into our morning routine. One of the guys heads the 10 meters down the river to catch breakfast. One starts checking on the NOAA forecast on the radio, and one starts to unfreeze our water filter. And I'm pulling out the morning firewood. I'm restarting our fire as it gets brighter. I notice there's this gorgeous pair of black labs rummaging around the outskirts of our camp. Pleasantly surprised, we are all pumped to find some pups, because we're idiots and none of us care where they came from. Within seconds, this raggedy looking West Virginia guy appears out of nowhere by a tree, shotgun over the shoulder, sweet jean jacket on and a cowboy hat. The good West Virginian look that I respect. He says morning and that we have a nice fire. The way he said it was chilling. We all felt like we could see right through him. We asked him how he got there. Mind you, the sun is barely peeking through the woods, and we're 14 miles in nowhere forest. And we haven't seen a trace of anyone in 5 days. The man says nothing, looks at us and turns to walk out into the dawn, with the dogs following. We're standing there dumbfounded, and when we find our pulse, immediately start looking from where he came from and which direction he was heading. Obviously we found nothing. No tracks, not even the dogs. But now to the survival part. We had snow in the forecast for most of the week, which we had almost every day. Not too much, maybe only 4 inches through the week, but we noticed it had started to get warmer. We're laying down for the night, checking our nightly forecast, and they're talking about the snow coming in for the night. No worries in our mind, at least it's not rain. False. We had limited cloud cover the day before, and the air was still pretty warm that night. The snow turned into rain. We hadn't taken rain precautions before we bedded down, since we were just expecting snow. We wake up around 3 a.m., packs and boots dripping. We get up to start getting an emergency plan together. The temperature is dropping, and we're wet. Precip turns to ice, with a whole day of precip ahead of us. We end up packing everything up, try to sanitize our area, but one of the guys starts going down. He's really lean, so he's pretty susceptible to cold weather injuries. We get all our dry clothing off us and get him into them. We propped up a makeshift shelter of boughs and tarps and an emergency blanket for him while we finished getting ready to step off. We rucked the 14 miles back to our car that morning and drove the 4 hours back. Lesson learned, it always rains. My house is on the biggest chunk of property in the tri-state area, about 108 acres, and was originally kind of a park, but wasn't supposed to be used as a park. Unfortunately, people from all over didn't get the memo that we had moved in, and therefore continued to party, hunt, and fish whenever they felt like it. Over the years, these problems began to go away, except for a couple. Before we talk about the perpetrators, or at least the leader, we should discuss what was behind the property. An asylum, mostly housing psychopaths, schizophrenics, and those who have suffered mental breakdowns. It isn't rare to hear random screaming for no reason coming from over there. There were 4 men who kept coming back and hunting in the middle of the night. We let some people hunt in the night on Saturday nights, but for the most part hunting was off limits. We were never able to catch these 4 middle-aged men who always wore masks. I mention that because their leader wore a creative mask, an especially frightening kind of mask. Most of the time, he bore a pig mask. These men were sneaky, they were smart, and that's what made them scary. I had 3 encounters with them, the first being in June of last year. A few friends and I had decided to go on an adventure through the woods, and we discovered something frightening. We had a fortress covered in beer cans with a chair at the top. Being the teenagers we were, we decided the smartest thing to do was to destroy all of the hunters' hard work by kicking the entire fortress down. Boy, did we mess up. We later returned to that fortress to check up on it, and that's when it got scary. It was rebuilt almost as a shrine to the last one, and spray painted around it was, "Try that again. We dare you." The second encounter happened during a simple walk at night. Sometimes when I get upset, I like to take walks through the woods. This time was at night, and it just so happened our favorite hunters were out hunting. I was walking alone minding my own business, when I see the man in the pig mask and he sees me. He now knows my face, and this becomes important later. I hear a deep laugh and he turns his gun towards me. I have no idea what he was planning, but I book it out of there ASAP so I didn't have to figure it out. The third and final encounter was the most blood-curdling. It occurred only about a week ago, and I was walking home from my cousin's house in the dark. I had my flashlight shining, and I felt safe for once, but something was off. The barn lights were on. They are never on. No one ever goes into the barn. The floors are falling through, and I simply brushed it off as a technical error. But then in the middle of the field I saw the man in the pig mask, and he saw me. And his words have haunted my dreams since he yelled at me, "Get the hell out of here before I make you." The way he said it still frightens me. It was so angry, so vicious, and so dead set on revenge. I haven't been in the woods since then. It was later discovered that in the barn they had been setting up shop from time to time. So in conclusion, I just want to leave a personal message. To my friend in the pig mask, let's never meet again. Especially not in my woods. About 5 years ago, me and a group of friends drunkenly decided to go camping. It was a decision made while being drunk, but when we sobered up next morning, we all thought it would be something really fun to do. We were on summer break, so we got together our gear and headed off in 2 different vehicles. Once we arrived to the state park, we all unloaded everything and started making our way through to try and find a decent clearing, not too far, so that we could drink our beers and carry on our little partying in peace. We walked for what felt like hours. I had to carry a whole load of cans in my backpack, and the further we got, the more complaining our group became, as we knew that it would take even longer to get more beers when we inevitably ran out. The guy who was leading us was called Chet, and as we kept going through, he insisted he knew the area and that there was a fantastic clearing just a little further up. This phrase, "a little further up," I still have trouble listening to today, as it really gets on my nerves, for he didn't stop saying it. And after walking for literally 3 hours, did we all say we were turning back. However, fortunately for Chet, 5 minutes later, we found a small but decent clearing, obviously not the one that he told us about. But we settled there as we were tired and started drinking. At some point during the drinking session, Chet went off to pee and didn't come back for a while, We just assumed that his pee had turned to a poop and waited up. About 40 minutes had passed. It was taking obscenely long. How far did he go? We decided at this point it would be best if a few of us went out to look for him. Of course, there's no cell phone signal this far into the wilderness, and we left with flashlights and began to look around. It didn't take long for the people who left to come back, saying that he wasn't within the immediate area, and we started to get worried. Some of us talked about calling the cops, but Chet was a responsible adult, and we thought that maybe he was just annoyed, trying to find the alternate campsite. Some of us convinced ourselves this was the case, but not me. I knew Chet quite well, and didn't think that he'd go along without us. He wasn't that buzzed yet. I was mentally debating with myself whether or not I should go get the cops, and decided that as it was quite late at night, and I wasn't sure if I could make my way back, that I'd wait for the morning and then see. Morning comes. Chet's tent remained unoccupied. At this point, we start getting very nervous. We shout, start calling out, and have no idea where he's at. I tell my friends that I'm going back to call the cops. I make the trek, running, panting, in record time for fear of my friend. When the cops get my message, they say that they'll look into it. To cut a long story short, we looked together with the people sent and couldn't find him. It was a horrifying ordeal. This was a number of years ago, and none of us know what happened to Chet. No body, no animals nearby that could have harmed him, as far as we're aware anyway, and no sudden drops in the area. Me and my friends have gone back with the solemn purpose to see if we can find any traces of our friend, but he vanished off the face of the earth. Wherever you are, Chet, I hope you rest in peace. Back in primary school, 3rd grade, we had this 3rd grade camp on our school's rugby field on a Friday night. No tents though. We all slept in the clubhouse on the field. It was a lit night. We played games, hide and seek, sang songs, and teased the 3rd grade couples. It was an amazing night, till my group of friends and I went out to hide on the other side of the rugby field, with all the lights turned off. We had 3 flashlights, and being 3rd graders, we were all already in this spooky, scary vibe. We were planning to go hide in the tree, where we spent our breaks during school, but quickly decided otherwise when we saw 2 men. Well, they may have been teenagers, but we were short, and it was quite dark. And ran back to our clubhouse and told the 3 class teachers who were spending the night with us. All us children were called inside the clubhouse for safety and supervision. The male teacher that was with us took a flashlight and went to check if they really were the 2 guys there. And if they were, how? As they must have broken into school, because the only way to get to the field was through the school. We were supposed to close the blinds in order not to see, but I was too curious, so kept peeking under the blind closest to me. To this day, I remember the teacher walking 40 meters until he was behind a tree. From my angle, I could see him. He was just standing there for 2 minutes, then came back and told the other teachers he saw nothing, but that they should call the police just in case. He was too darn scared to check it out himself. Well, I feel you, bro. Anyway, later that night, 2 cops arrived, and a few minutes later, 2 more vans pulled up. We were sent home. Some of the parents weren't happy to come and fetch us at 10 p.m., and the children who didn't have lifts had to go sleep at the teachers' houses. We were never told what the cops found that night. So I did some digging, many years later, as I'm 16 now. The creepy thing was, the Monday that we went to school again, my group and I went to the tree where we saw two men. The tree had lots of cuts in it, clearly by some knife. There were also numbers written all over the tree, but the sight of a big body-sized hole covered up with sand made my group and I decide not to sit there anymore. What I found out was that this mentally ill person was coerced to bury a body there that night. We were incredibly close to it when we were playing hide and seek, and I'm so glad we didn't venture any further, as our fates might have been the same as the poor soul who was being put in the ground of our school. About 11 years ago, when I was 16, my family and friends went on an ATV trip to the North Woods in Wisconsin, somewhere in Iron Country. We went on yearly trips where we would ride all day but head back to the same camp at night. This particular trip was our first time in the area, so we found a good-looking campsite and made camp, then went riding. The trails in this area were not all too exciting, gravel logging roads that stretched miles with no one on them. So we cut the day short heading back to camp and deciding we would pack up camp and move next morning to a campground with better trails. Night came, and my dad and stepmom slept in a small cabin, while my two friends, stepbrother and I slept in a tent. It had been dark for a while, and we weren't getting any sleep, so we decided to take a walk around the campsite. The campground was almost at capacity, but no one was out at the fires, and it seemed like everyone was asleep. We walked the entire campground and were almost back to our tent, and we decided to stop and stare at the stars. We are from the Chicagoland area and have a lot of light pollution, so the stars that far north are very impressive. As we sat there pointing at the stars and constellations with our low-quality flashlights, I noticed a satellite slowly moving across the sky. It was moving in a straight path across the sky, and I pointed it out and followed it with a flashlight until everyone saw it. It reached the center of the sky with its path, when suddenly a large white light illuminated myself and the other three. We stood there, staring up at the sky in awe of what was happening. I don't remember any of us talking or questioning the light, and I also can't tell you exactly how much time passed underneath it. When the light stopped shining, all our eyes were still facing the sky, and we saw the same satellite dart across the sky in the same path. Stress on the word dart, as the object moved about 10 times faster than before when I first noticed it. All four of us looked at each other shocked at what had just happened, and I immediately went back to camp. We talked about what it could have been and what could have happened, but never came to any conclusion other than it being a UFO. The next day we told my parents about the encounter and moved to a new campsite, and business as usual. For a few years I completely forgot about the event, which is strange in its own sense. However, to this day, all four of us remember the strange encounter with the bright light. This is a story I heard from my dad on 3 separate occasions. He is a hardened Navy SEAL, has done it all, traveled the world, and is generally someone who is known not to be messed with. He has always been very strict, but also never lies. Which is why on the few times he told me this story, it creeped me out a lot more. He isn't one to believe in the paranormal, but this, I think, is his exception to the rule, as he swears up and down it's true. Anyway, a number of years ago, at least 40, when he was in his early teens, his grandparents had a big forest behind their house, many acres, and he would sometimes pitch a tent for fun and spend a night in the forest and come back in the morning for breakfast. On one of these nights, he made his way out, put up his tent, and tried relaxing, listening to the sound of nature. He fell asleep very quickly, but woke up in the dead of night. There was some strange rustling going on outside the tent. He, as you can expect, being the hard-nut kid he was, assumed it was an animal or a person, most likely a family member, and without trepidation unzipped and came out. That's when he was confronted with a creature the likes of which he'd never seen. It was like a dog, but fully bipedal, standing there. It wasn't even staring at him. It was at least 50 feet away, staring up at the pale moonlight. It had strong facial features, exaggeratedly strong muscles, and looked like it could tear apart a car. He stood there in stunned silence, the creature, as he thought, completely unaware of him. My father thought it would be unwise to make his presence known, and as quietly as he could, began backing away into the tent. He sat down in the tent, stared at the creature still, while trying to do it up again. That's when the creature turned and cocked its head straight towards my dad. They locked eyes for a second, and not a moment passed, the creature bolted away. It ran at a speed the likes of which my father did not expect. He even stood up to see where it went, but it was gone. Safe to say, my father just ran straight home, and he didn't go camping again for many, many years until we were small children. I think he needed about a 20-year break before he felt confident again that whatever it was that he saw that night wouldn't come looking for him once more. Do any of you remember Outdoor Ed? If you don't remember or just plain don't know, I'll give you a brief rundown. Outdoor education, or ED for short, is a school camping trip that takes students to the woods where they can learn more about the outdoors. My Outdoor Ed's trip took me to the snow-infested mountains, and for the most part it was completely boring save for the occasional snowball fight. Then the last night occurred, and I will never forget it for as long as I live. Now before that night, I didn't have any trouble sleeping, but the last night, it was like something was wrong. At first I assumed it was just homesickness, first time away from my parents, you see. But then I looked to my cabin mates and counselor, and from the look on their face, I could tell they were feeling it too. It was a tense several minutes, and then something started calling our names. It was barely more than a whisper, but all of us heard it. The voice seductive, alluring. It made us want to go outside, but the small amount of common sense I had in the back of my head ordered me to stay put. Charlie. My counselor did not feel the same way and left the cabin to investigate. We could hear him yelling from outside. Come on, guys. This isn't funny. The kids are trying to sleep. I guess he assumed it was some sort of prank. After a few minutes of silence, he rushed back inside. There's someone out here. Stay inside. He grabbed something from his bag and left. Listen, this is your only warning. I'm armed, and if you intend to hurt these kids, I will shoot. There was silence, and I heard the loudest noise I had ever heard. 2 consecutive bangs. I could hear the other counselors come outside and hear them talk. I can't hear what they say, but my counselor comes back and says that for the rest of the night we have to stay indoors. Eventually, I slept and drifted out. Next morning, As the students are boarding the buses to leave, we see police cars on the road and police officers talking to my counselor. He described it as something barely resembling a human, taller than 10 feet, with skin so pale you could mistake it for snow. It was all he could see before he fired and the creature ran off. Suffice to say, I've had nightmares about it and am now forbidden from going on any more camping trips. Now that I'm a bit older and a little bit wiser, my best guess is that it was a Wendigo. But this was Southern California, an unusual place for such a cryptid. Every summer, I go to this camp deep in Pennsylvania called French Creek Bible Camp. I was with the grade 11 to 12 age group. There's been many stories passed around over the years about evil creatures living in the woods. One was called the Goat Man. He was described to be like the devil himself, having red eyes. Some claimed to have seen him, but I did not believe them. There used to be 5 different sleeping areas at this camp, 3 for guys and 2 for girls. But a few years ago, Sleeping Area 5 burnt to the ground one night while people were camping there. No one is sure how the fire started, because the cabins do not have electricity, and fire officials said it wasn't a forest fire that caused Unit 5 to burn. This was already strange enough. Now I was in Unit 4, the furthest away from civilization. One night, our cabin door swung wide open and crashed against the wall, as if someone kicked in our door. But we shined a flashlight outside and investigated, and saw nothing. We told some people the next morning, but we didn't think much of it. Keep in mind, the weather was not at all windy. Was this a sign we shouldn't be here? Now, this is where stuff got intense. It was the second to last night before we were supposed to go home. Once again, the weather was calm. It was around 2:30 a.m., and my entire cabin was awoken to the loud sound of our wooden door being slammed open. Moments later, we hear a loud cracking noise, and I notice the large tree next to our cabin is falling towards us. I believe in the split second I looked out the window and at the tree falling, I saw a dark figure fleeing the area. The tree fell onto our cabin and crashed through the roof onto my cabin mate's bed. If I had not looked out the window, he would have been crushed by the weight of the tree and/or the ceiling falling. This tree was very large, at least 100 feet tall, and everyone in the surrounding area came to see what happened and made sure that we were all okay. We looked at the tree, and it was cut cleanly across the bottom, as if someone cut it with a chainsaw. But we were so close to the tree that we would have heard someone sawing it, so that's impossible. I truly believe someone or something was trying to get rid of us or punish us that night. Needless to say, I had my mum take me home right away, and have not been back since. About 20 years ago, a friend and I were hiking on the AT in northern Georgia. We camped at a place called Indian Graveyard. There were no graves there, just the stumps of fallen trees that had died due to an infestation. But it looked like a graveyard. It was early spring, and the weather was kind of sketchy. That night, as we were going to sleep in the tents, the wind was blowing pretty hard. Suddenly it stopped, like a switch had been thrown. We sat up, concerned that something bad was about to happen weather-wise. As we sat there listening, we heard footsteps outside the tent. They moved slowly around the tent from the right, behind on the left, then stopped at the front. We were terrified. Without warning, my friend Donnie shouted at the top of his lungs, "You better get the hell out of here. I have a gun, and I'll blow your damn head off." Well, he didn't have a gun, and he scared the crap out of me for screaming like that. He told me later he thought the footsteps might have been a drunk redneck messing with us, or someone trying to get up to no good. Right after he screamed, a huge round light flared on. It was about 10 feet off the ground, about 10 feet in diameter, a perfect circle of blinding light, so bright we could see it through the orange tent material. Silently, it floated there without moving for what seemed like hours, and with no warning the light went out, and when it did, at the exact same time, the wind started blowing again. With only one flashlight, Donnie and I abandoned our camp and ran nearly a mile to where our car was parked. We got in and drove to Helen, a little mountain town about 8 miles away. We parked in a parking lot and stayed in the car until morning. Right after sunrise, we went back to our camp. Nothing was missing, but we did find the ground disturbed around the tent by holes in the ground, about 1 inch in diameter, each evenly spaced around the tent. Each hole was about 6 inches deep. We grabbed all of our stuff and went home. To this day, I haven't been back to Indian Graveyard, and doubt I ever will. I live in Finland, and it's pretty much all forest here. When I was a kid, I went for cross-country biking near to our home. There is a roughly 2-kilometer loop of a forest path in the forest. It is rideable, if not a bit difficult at some points. After just riding a few minutes on a narrow forest path, I see a figure walking ahead of me. It looks like a hooded elderly lady, walking really slowly. I can't see her face or anything, just a dark hood covering her. I recall she being very tall, but I was also only 13 years old, so she could have just been normal size. I went behind her, but the path is too narrow to overtake her on any of the sides, and I get this heavy feeling in my chest, telling me not to try it. I can't explain it, but something just felt very off when I got closer to her. I stop my bike, get off, and watch her walk ahead of me. I then think that this is fairly silly, and she must be startled if she turns around and sees me there. So I think to act cool, to turn down and pick up a blueberry. I pick it up, raise my head back to the road ahead of me, and there's nothing. I can see the path ahead for maybe 50 meters, and it's just impossible that she would have just done that distance in 5 seconds. I then try to reason with myself. She must have jumped off the road, since there are extremely thick bushes and I can't see into them. I felt a bit uneasy, but decided to continue. I ride about 500 more meters, and then there's a cliff, where I can see down the road ahead for another 500 meters. And there she is. I can see her walking there, again really slowly. Again, tall figure covered in a dark hood. I can't see her face, but I can see the hood she's wearing, and she's walking slowly on the road. I really couldn't figure out how she made it there in such a short time, since even I couldn't do the distance in that time without my bike. I'm extremely alarmed at this point, and decide to continue. I drive the hill down to the spot where I saw her before, and there's nothing. At this part of the forest, it's more open and I can see quite far in any direction. Yet she's nowhere to be seen, and yet she was there just 30 seconds before. I continue my trip, and finally finish my first loop of the trail, and decide to go another round. After going for a couple of minutes, there she is, at exactly the same spot I saw her the first time, tall, dark and hooded, walking slowly. I got freaked out by this. I rode off the woods as fast as I could in a total panic to my friend's house, which was actually further away from the woods than my own. Until this day, I still have no idea what I saw, and I get the chills remembering her figure. I was 13 and in a wilderness treatment program for behavioral stuff. The place was out in the mountains of southern Utah, by a place called Joe's Camp. Plenty of weird stuff happened out there, and I have a few stories, but this freaked me out the most, and the physical feeling I got, I can still conjure up today. One night we were sitting around the fire telling scary stories, and the topic of Wendigos came up. Some swore up and down that they were real, and one staff member said they were old tales of encounters in the area. We bantered about it for a few minutes, and then, being the edgy teen I was, I blurted out something like, "Screw a Wendigo, I'll kill one with my bare hands if it shows itself." And later that night, when I was asleep, I had this dream. I was basically watching this deer in a clearing, and I had the worst feeling ever of doom. And then suddenly this deer was crushed, I mean obliterated, like I really can't describe it. It was kind of sucked up under a big rock, and its spinal cord flew out and impaled me. And I got the feeling when I was impaled, and it was the worst and weirdest pain I've ever had. The best way to describe it was like a dirty scraping feeling. I was then, in the dream, looking at my feet out at the end of my tarp tent, and I was ripped out the tent. I woke up suddenly and was sitting in my sleeping bag outside my tent, making the strangest noise I've ever heard. It was like a wheezing screech, a primal death cry. I looked around, quickly crawled back to my tent, and wrote it off as a bad dream, and didn't really speak about it while I was there. I don't know how to plausibly explain it, other than a weird dream and sleepwalking, but it definitely jarred me, and when I remember it, I can't help but feel incredibly uneasy. After a heavy night of drinking and camping, we woke up and nobody wanted to make breakfast, so we decided to drive into town and find dinner. We're approaching where the dirt meets the pavement, and come up on a dozen sheriffs blocking the road, 2 of which have rifles pointed on us. We stop the truck about 40 feet from them, and hear them yell over the bullhorn to stick our hands out the windows. They then instruct us to approach on foot, with hands in the air. They search my truck and find it loaded with loads of guns and beer. That's when they tell us that a Forest Service agent has been shot nearby and passed. They eventually let us go, but telling us our camping gear is forfeit until the guy is caught. We didn't want to leave our gear and go home, so we end up at a near casino and continued the party there. A few hours later, someone in the casino says that there are loads of cops outside. We go out, and there must have been at least 100 sheriffs, local PDs, and every branch of law enforcement. Apparently the murderer had stopped at the casino gas station, and an officer recognized him. The law enforcement officer drew his gun, the murderer went for his, and the murderer shot him dead. We went back to camp, and then home the next day. I checked the newspaper article. They had a map of where the murder happened. It was a 1/4 mile down the road from our campsite. This one time, I went camping when I was 13 with my family up in Michigan, somewhere near where Mount Sugarloaf is. It's around 3 a.m. I'm wide awake reading a comic book that I'd brought. I was a pretty large insomniac, you see, and could only sleep for a few hours at a time, when I hear twigs breaking and leaves rustling somewhere to the back edge of our campsite. It's hard to explain, but I feel not afraid but extremely aware, like how I imagine rabbits feel when they sense a predator is nearby. I remember flipping on my stomach and edging towards my little sister who was against the outer edge of the tent. I wasn't thinking it at the time, but I think I was instinctively moving to protect her from it. I don't know. The sound got closer. It's not loud, but I could tell by the muted steps that it was big. By this time, I'm practically on top of my sister, and my eyes are as wide as they can go, desperately trying to see in the minimal light from the moon that filtered through the canvas of the tent. That's when I saw it. The light of the moon outside illuminated this huge shape. It was hard to tell, but it looked like it had a long snout and long ears. I could hear its fur or skin brushing against the tent canvas, and my heart is pounding so hard my ears hurt from it. This thing was sniffing along the tent. I could feel its breath through the thin barrier of the tent. The only thing between me and it. I'm certain this thing would have very happily slaughtered me. And all of a sudden, it stands, its shadow curving along the roof of the tent. I'm waiting for my life to flash before my eyes, but I'm just pulling a blank. All I feel is pure horror, the likes of which I have never felt again. But then it just slowly disappears. Whatever it was, chose to leave. The sound of the underbrush as it left was the only thing that convinced me that I wasn't hallucinating. I stayed up for the rest of the night, convinced it was going to return. It didn't, and I have refused to camp anywhere in the Midwest since. I grew up in very rural Arkansas. I once stayed in a tent in the backyard with a friend when we were about 12. I had a dog named Shadow that stayed outside, and she was the bestest girl. My backyard butted up against hundreds of acres of woods, so coyotes and bobcats were pretty common but never came into the property because of Shadow. That night, as we stayed in the tent reading scary stories and talking girl talk, we heard what sounded like a woman screaming not that far away. I froze because my dad had told me that mountain lions sounded exactly like that. I wasn't even sure we'd make it back to my back door if we ran for it. My friend was terrified and thought a woman needed help, and I was trying to tell her that we had no neighbors for miles, and at that moment, Shadow started growling just outside the tent. I've probably never been so terrified before or since. She started barking and moving away from the tent in one direction, and that's when my dad threw open the back door and did one of those high-pitched dad whistles and ran towards the tent, yelling at us to get out, pistol in hand. We ended up sleeping inside that night. A few weeks later, when we were heading down the gravel mine for target practice, a massive pit in the ground about a half-mile away from home, we saw a mountain lion on the other side, and Dad murmured to me that it must be my friend. It was massive and terrifying and beautiful, and I have never seen another one in person since. One of my friends always has these get-rich-quick schemes or shady ways of making money on the side. In one of his more brilliant moves, he decides he's going to rent a house out near the country line to host illegal poker games. Anyway, this property is probably 4 or 5 acres with a tiny rundown church about 1,000 yards away on one side, and a redneck guy living in a trailer probably a quarter of a mile or so on the other side. However, the property backs up to the woods, and since it's always cheaper than the range, I and a third friend ask our renter friend if we can go shoot some guns on the property. He obliges us, and we head out there on a Saturday afternoon and find a nice barn at the tree line to go shoot into. Now we're just shooting paper targets with pistols, so we're not that far back and don't need that much room to do it. After a few magazines, we decide to venture into the woods to see how far back the property goes. We get down to the bottom of the hill and see the fluorescent ribbons that the surveyors tied to the trees to mark the property line. We realize the property is bigger than we thought, because we're about 150 to 200 yards in the woods at this point. Just as we're remarking about how big it is, we see a dead animal about 10 yards away across the property line. Walking up to examine it, we see it's a goat that's had its head cut off, like cleanly done by a human cut off. Then we see a severed goat head a little further away. The creepy part is it's not the same goat. The fur is different and cut differently. Imagine one head cut off a chin and then another cut off at the shoulders. Well, we didn't stick around to see if there was a goat neck anywhere, because we realized that it wasn't decayed very much and must have been done in the last day or two. Now, if we weren't armed, it would have been a lot scarier, but it was still creepy because I fear humans more than anything you can get out in the woods. Now, I say this was out there in the country, but it was in South Carolina, so there's not really a crazy expanse of wilderness being an East Coast state. That's pretty much all settled by people. The thing that gets me is that there was a serial killer they caught there not too long ago. This incident happened 10 years back, so perhaps he was killing animals first. My whole family, of about 9 people, went for a drive to my grandfather's favorite mountain. He recently passed, and we took my grandma because she wanted to go. It was a caravan of 2 trucks on a muddy dirt road near the top of a mountain. We stop, get out to look at the view from the top of the ridge. I'm about 6 years old and the youngest in the group. Everyone makes it to the top before I'm even halfway there, and they stare in silence. My brother breaks the silence by saying, "Hey," as he scoops me up before I can reach the top and see the view. He carries me back down to the truck. Everyone is murmuring and taking pictures, and I'm whining about never being able to do anything fun. I found out what happened about 15 years later. The photos from the trip were in a family album. I asked them about the mountain and the view I wasn't allowed to see. My mum explained that once they reached the top of the ridge, they saw a steep mountain slide covered in these large, perfectly black circles, as though the grass had been burnt. That's why they were shocked. I had a lot of anxiety as a kid, and I was terrified of natural disasters and stuff. My older brother knew this, and stepped in and directed my attention elsewhere so that I wouldn't flip out, while the other adults took pictures. My brother was the best. The pictures of the circles came out black or blank when they developed them. No one had a picture that showed the perfect black circles, yet all the other pictures were fine. I live in northeastern Oklahoma, and I consider myself a camping/fishing enthusiast. One spring night, me and 2 friends decided to go fishing. It's around midnight. We're going to a place that was once a maintained primitive camping area. This is not a remote location, but it's not very well known either. As we approach the turnoff for our spot, we see another vehicle slowly turning out of it, and proceeding in the way in which we came. We pass them, and a friend says how he figured no one else would be around. We get to our spot, get our gear out, and begin to prepare. But as we chat, drink a few beers, we all notice an unspoken uneasiness. Something is just not right. Usually I'm a trooper, fishing until the sun comes up, but I'm the first to crack. I explain to my friends how I feel, and that we should leave, and that I have a bad feeling. They agree. We load up, and while slowly driving through the old campground, we notice some brightly glowing embers in an area that no one has been. My friend who's driving stops without even thinking, and goes for a look. He's startled, telling us to come see. What we saw were the remains of 3 crosses made of wood that would stand about 12 inches if upright. They had been burned along with the small campfire, and to make it even better, We were all lying on freshly turned soil, which resembled a freshly dug grave. We freaked, got the hell out of there fast. Thank you, sweet baby Jesus, that we are home free, was all I thought. When we approached the exit of the old campground, we noticed a vehicle parked on the side of the road. We passed it, and realized it was the same car we passed on the way in. There was no one in the car. They had doubled back, and were likely watching us, waiting to do who knows what. I was leading a backpacking trip for a Girl Scout camp. There were 2 other adults, the counselor in the kids group who was supposed to care for the kids, as I taught wilderness skills. Our first day out, we arrived and chose where to camp. I told the kids and staff to set up their tents. I set mine up quickly and then told the other 2 adults that I was going off to poop. I walked a ways away from the kids, dug my hole, and was doing my business when gunshots fired. I wasn't finished though, so although I knew the kids would be spooked, I trusted the counselors were doing their job and taking care of them. I finished, left no trace, and hiked back to the camp where the kids set up. I arrived about 5 minutes after the gunshots. There was pandemonium. The girls were panicking. One had apparently taken the lead and suggested that everyone change into camouflage colors. A few had changed, the others asked me what to do. What I couldn't understand was where the hell the other staff were. I calmed the kids, explained to them that there were often hunters in the area and that they weren't madmen out to get them. I told them that if they really wanted to change, bright clothing was actually best, but they were fine. I then asked where the other adults were. They just shrugged. I found the other 2 counselors in their tent, which they had pitched far from the kids. They were relaxing, reading magazines they'd apparently packed for entertainment, and giving each other quizzes. I was frankly shocked and appalled. I lost my temper and yelled and asked them why they hadn't gone and checked on the kids when they heard gunshots. They shrugged. We assumed you were taking care of it. But I told you I was leaving to crap in the woods. You 2 were responsible for the kids when I was gone. We thought you'd come back. We're taking a break. So I dealt with the kids, counselors included. I met the hunters while refilling water and let them know to avoid hunting in the area where we're camping. When we got back to camp, my supervisor got a full report, and those 2 staff members were never given a backpacking group again or placed together. The kids, luckily, had a good time on the rest of the trip. This happened 2 days ago, in southwest Sweden. It was around 5 p.m. in the afternoon, and I decided to meet up with one of my friends. We both have mopeds, scooters, and drove to the grocery store to get a snack for our small trip. After that, we headed towards a beautiful sheep pasture that I had been to once and wanted to visit again. It was maybe 15 minutes away from the center of our town. After a while, I came to a narrow road surrounded by a forest. Since it rarely drives any kind of vehicle out there, I started to drive on the middle of the road, and sometimes even the part of the road meant for the approaching cars. At one moment, I looked in my rearview mirror and saw my friend driving close to the edge of the road. At first, I thought she was trying to make a point that I should keep to my part of the road, but then she drove even closer to the edge and almost fell into a ditch. I stopped and waited until she caught up with me. We were both laughing, and I asked her what happened. She said she was distracted by something weird on a tree besides the road and forgot to turn. We laughed and kept on going. Later on, we sat in the sheep pasture eating our snacks. We started talking about it again for some reason, and I asked her what she saw. And what she described was some kind of wood plank nailed to a tree, and that it looked like a figure, a person with just holes as eyes. My reaction was, "What the hell, that's disturbing." And she responded with, "Yeah, kinda creepy." We decided to try and locate it again on our way home. We stopped by the road and I turned off the engine. When I looked up, I spotted it right away and it gave me the creeps. It was hanging there in a tree, looking all dead, and I decided to take a picture of it when we drove home. When I saw it, my thoughts went straight to cults and murderers that put up some kind of sign to show where they've been, or a hint that they're about to make a move. I don't think I'll go there again, and I'm not sure what it could be, but it just didn't feel right. My property is pretty old. We bought it from an old couple who gave up on it after a tornado destroyed the silos, barns, and a couple of sheds. We spent years fixing it back up, but only one of the barns got rebuilt. The other is still collapsed. The shed is worn down and the door is blown out, which makes it always scary walking by a dark shed with an empty opening. This silo fell over and is next to the shed, which is across from the two barns. All of this was on my walk to a deer stand in the furthest field in the back of my property. I was a freshman in college at the time and hunted until it was dark. I left the stand and started quietly walking back. I always had an eerie feeling walking by the torn down barns, but at night, it's always way worse. I forgot to mention there's an old well with a concrete slab on the top of it, but the concrete siding had a hole. It always gave me the chills. As I'm walking by the wells and barns, everything is super quiet. I all of a sudden jolted my eyes to the fence along the field by the shed. I heard a chain whipping sound and faint giddy laughter. When I looked up, I saw two men in prison gang garments, white and black striped suits, quickly galloping away from me alongside the fence. Both were laughing and had chains on their hands and feet. I quickly fell to the ground and loaded my rifle in terror. I looked through my scope where I saw them running alongside at last. It was the biggest field on our property, so they had another 100 yards to go alongside the fence before they hit the woods, but they were gone. I laid there searching for 10 minutes before chalking it up to being sleep deprived from the morning hunt. I never had experienced something so real. Or did I imagine it? While I was growing up, my family would visit the same lake every year for a week every summer. As we got older, we would visit a large rock called the Cliffs and jump off. The rock was only 15 feet tall at the highest point, but the water was really deep. When we got older, we would jump in and try to touch the bottom, but we never could. When my brother and I were in our teens, we took kayaks out to the cliffs to jump on our own. We jumped off several times, and when we got too cold, we took a break on the top of the cliffs to warm up in the sun. As we were sitting there, we noticed a white shape in the water, floating towards the surface. It was a letter, H. Eventually, it sank back into the water, and we lost sight of it. Before we could look away or say anything, another shape floats up. It was the letter E. Eventually, it too sank below, but it was soon followed by two more letters, L and P. We didn't jump in after that. We stood up and left without saying a word. We never mentioned it to anyone, and I forgot it had even happened for a while. Several years ago, I was working at a camp counselor, and I told this story as a ghost story. I'd forgotten about it, and I texted my brother to see if I hadn't just made it up completely. I asked him if he remembered the time we went jumping off cliffs alone and saw something in the water. He replied yes, that he remembered. I asked him what it was, and his reply was, the letters spelled help. A few years ago, I wanted to take my girlfriend out on a camping trip to get at one with nature. 2 days in, and we were having a great time. We did some exploring, found a really pretty waterfall that we thought we could have been the first to see in ages, and generally spent our time relaxing and reading, which is what we both enjoyed doing. However, part of the reason I decided to camp in this specific place was because I wanted somewhere isolating. I wanted it to be just the two of us. In the middle of the night, I awoke. I heard a weird sound, like a knock on a tree. I twist around and my girlfriend is lightly snoring in her sleeping bag. I rub my eyes and listen. There's a tapping. It's carrying on. And then a sound. It took me a while to identify it, but it was definitely scratching on the tent. Very light. That very distinctive sound as it goes from top to bottom. I want to call out, but am petrified. Someone is outside. And then I hear a whisper, "Hello, dearie." It was Brickworthy. I unzipped myself after about a minute, didn't hear a noise, and slowly peek my head out, seeing if anything is visible. It's a full moon, and it's quite bright. I look around the clearing, and there's no one. The thing is, I didn't hear a sound. Unless whoever said that floated away, I have no idea how they left the area without making a single sound. I used to do a ton of camping, but one night still early on, I was up with 2 friends in the middle of the night, just hanging out in a field next to the campsite, looking at the stars and the almost full moon. It was so bright outside it was almost like day, when suddenly I noticed a faint whisper. I thought it was someone from camp, but no, it came from the other direction. We all shut up and listened to the faint "Hey," to which we follow. We cross the field away from camp as the whisper grew louder, but only ever so slightly, until we come across a road. Across the road was a fenced-in area, but it was a pretty crappy fence that was easily crossed. On the other side of the fences was a small woods. The trees were spaced pretty far apart from each other, despite the bright moon. It was completely pitch black in those trees, and you could barely see past the first few rows. And now the voice was much louder, but still as if someone was trying to whisper. A voice that sounded like a little girl. "Come play." No women were there with us on this trip. No girls, just the sounds of little girls calling out to us in the pitch darkness to play at 1 a.m. We decided not to investigate this any further. I live on a small 5-acre hobby farm, nestled amongst a bunch of other 5-ish-acre farms and homesteads. Not the suburbs, but not exactly deep woods either. Last year, some asshole in a pickup truck pulled over on the road beside my house and started shooting into the forested area of my property. I was just sitting at the kitchen table when I heard a huge gunshot. I thought it might have been a backfire, but then it happened again. I ran outside and could just see the guy through our hedge. He had a very big rifle and was pointing at it, shooting at my goats. One of my goats is slim and brown and looks a bit like a deer. But dude, there are houses and people all over the place. Part of me wanted to march over and rip him a new one, but the other part of me told me I didn't want to become tragic headlines, so I just snuck closer to get a better look. But he got back into his truck and drove away. Turns out, one of my neighbors was outside at the time. He ducked behind a tree to avoid being shot. We called the cops, but we never managed to get his license plate number. I have gone on a yearly spring turkey hunting trip for the past 7 years. I couldn't go this past year due to joining the military. Around my 3rd year in, my dad and I left to go fishing one day, leaving my dad's best friend and his father-in-law back at camp. When we returned, there was another fellow back at camp, not really all that uncommon as we camp right along the Appalachian Trail. Well, we got back there and figured that they had made a friend. I sat at the campfire with the guy and the father-in-law, while my dad and his best friend go get firewood. Now we're a really friendly group, and this guy wants to make camp. We politely say no, and that there isn't any room at our spot. He leaves and goes to make camp right down the road, where there are more spots. When my dad and his best friend get back, they load up all the guns and call the state troopers. I get handed a gun, and I'm told to be wary. I'm not sure what's going on. I just comply until I'm told the story. Turns out the guy was wanted for murder, self-admitted, who had hiked the trail all the way up to New England with virtually no gear. When asked if he was carrying a weapon, he trailed off and didn't give a full answer. When I was out fishing, the guy said he needed to change and dropped tow in front of the two of us that stayed behind. That was the first time in the 25+ years the trip had been going on that any of the guns were loaded at the campsite. I've been camping once, and never will again. So a few friends and I planned a trip to take our NOs to a camping ground and stay there the night. We got there, set up, made some s'mores and whatnot, and went to bed. Being the dumb high schoolers that we were, we did not check the weather, and it began to thunderstorm very badly about an hour into sleeping. We all rushed into my car, all 6 of us, and sat there for about an hour. After the storm passed, we got out and began trying to set up again. I hadn't taken more than 2 steps out the car when we heard a loud crash off in the distance. My first instinct was to get back to the car, but we came to the consensus that we should investigate. So we took some flashlights and walked down the road, about 500 yards, to find that a huge tree had crashed on a couple's Airstream. They were outside of it with their dogs, and the woman was shaking because she said the trunk landed about 2 feet from her head. We ended up calling the very reluctant park ranger, who came to take a look. He let us out of the campground, and we just drove back to one of our friends' houses for the night. It's really scary. I'm not sure what would have happened if we went down the road and had found the lady's head smashed in by that tree trunk. A few fraternity brothers and I were backpacking in Nantahala National Forest and met some guys, local guys, and I mean not local hangout bros, but local backwoods, lived there for generations, hate the federal government and society kind of people. Guys that had apparently been helping Eric Rudolph, the Olympic bomber, hide in the national forest by supplying him with food drops. Really weird drunken campfire conversations. They took us to one of their hideout/drop-off caves. They were too serious, and the whole reason they trusted us was because some things were said drunkenly to make them think that we were of a similar mindset to him and their worldviews. We parted ways and spent a few days trying to figure out if it was all rubbish. That same week, they catch Eric Rudolph in the dumpster of a Piggly Wiggly 3 miles away from where we met the guys, and 4 miles from the cave that they would drop stuff off for him. Every single thing these guys said matched up with every single news story that was on the news. We even gave them a bottle of Jack, which they said they'd give to Eric. Creepy as hell. The drunken conversations I had with these 2 guys at 3 a.m. sitting in the middle of nowhere are hauntingly creepy in retrospective. I was winter camping in northern Wisconsin with a few buddies when at around 11 p.m. a guy appears in the firelight out of nowhere with no flashlight or headlamp. Now this place is not a campground, nor a national forest, or any land designated for camping, just wilderness. The nearest town is approximately 12 miles away, and the roads aren't plowed, so they're nearly impassable this time of year unless you have the right equipment. This guy sits down, has a couple of beers, is friendly, and leaves after about 45 minutes and disappears back into the forest. We have been camping and exploring this area for about a decade, and from the direction he came from, there is only forest that empties into vast swamps. I don't know how or where he was going or surviving that night, because it was midnight, and we never saw or heard a truck leave on the only road in and out of this area. There are no cabins back here, no camps, nothing. It was February in northern Wisconsin, and the low that night was around 5 degrees Fahrenheit. When I was younger, probably between 10 and 11, I went camping with my family. I'll just get right to it. It was about 1 or 2 in the morning, and I couldn't really sleep. The tent me and my brother were in was really hot and very uncomfortable. Anyway, while I was trying to go to bed, I heard a very faint whimper. I tried to ignore it, because I figured I was just tired. Our campsite was along a road with many other camps nearby. The whimpers started to get louder, and then turned into crying. I heard footsteps outside of our tent, and a girl crying her eyes out. Now let me tell you, it didn't go faint, it got louder and louder. It remained in the same spot the entire time. That's so important, because it indicates that she was looking at our tent site, crying. It then gets worse. Then it turned into a full-on scream for a few seconds, then cuts out. When she started screaming, my brother woke up. We both look at each other and just get all the pillows and stuff our heads under them. We couldn't sleep at all that night. I'm glad we left next morning. When I was 11, I went tent camping with teenage cousins on the Sioux Reservation, as they lived there. We were in an area we had followed several trails to find. We were inside the tent, and they were telling me a story about shapeshifters as the sun was going down. Suddenly there was a beautiful glow, like when the sun bursts out through the clouds and makes everything golden. It highlighted shapes going by the tent and casting shadows, and started as a nice experience. Then there was a loud boom, and the shadow of a large bird came right at us, and the tent fell down on top of us. They were genuinely scared, which made me even more terrified. We hightailed it back through those trails, and went home in the dark, barely able to breathe. We were going so fast. I still don't know what happened or why, but I can tell you I don't go tent camping anymore. While my brother and I were camping at this primitive campsite in West Texas, it was about 12:30 at night, and we start hearing this very faint opera music in the forest around us. After heating up SpaghettiOs on our fire, which the park ranger specifically told us not to make, we'd noped the hell out of there and hiked the 6 miles back by moonlight to our truck and drove home. It was like it was following us, because we heard it all the way about a mile away from the parking lot. The reason it was creepy was because when we got to our campsite, after getting lost and escorted by the same park ranger from earlier in the story, he told us we were lucky to be the only people for miles around because of how peaceful it was. He said there was no one else there. This happened in the woods and changed my view of the world as a teenager. Up the street from my childhood house was a couple trailers. I had a 4-wheeler and would ride up the trails all day. One day I'm riding and I get this random horrible feeling. So I stop and get off at the ATV and start walking up the trail. Well, some arsehat puts a piece of fishing line across the trail that would easily take my head off. I'm guessing that the feeling I had in the pit of my chest was that I was being watched, or that I subconsciously noticed the fishing line. I have no idea why I stopped that day, and it baffled me ever since. But it has honestly changed my life. We camped on a remote beach in northern Australia on an Aboriginal reserve, as we had special permits. When we woke up in the morning, we noticed a huge tail drag and footprints where a croc had walked by our tent during the night. The croc was on the other side of the bay. That is, of course, assuming it's the same one, and must have been at least 6 meters long. As you can imagine, we made haste, packing up all our things and moving the hell away from there. I was out camping on a shoreline in Alaska for field work. It was getting dark, and I started falling asleep, with my bear spray next to me. In the middle of the night, I hear a deep, angry grunting sound. I immediately grabbed my bear spray and started yelling, "Hey, bear!" The noise doesn't stop for a solid 2 minutes, and I'm literally thinking it's the end. But then I hear a large splash. I never want to hear another sea lion growl in the middle of the night again.